How dare he ask to spare his life when Angie begged for hers? How dare he? How dare he?
As the sun rose on June 13th, 1996, the city of Idaho Falls was rocked by the discovery of a brutal murder. Angie Raye Dodge, a young and vibrant 18-year-old, was found dead in her apartment by her two colleagues. Shock and horror rippled through the community as the news of her tragic end spread like wildfire. Detectives swiftly launched a widespread investigation, determined to apprehend the perpetrator responsible for this heinous crime. And finally, a suspect emerged, and justice was served, or so everyone thought. But was the real culprit caught? Was the case closed? Or was there more to the story that remained hidden for years? Angie Raye Dodge came into the world on December 21st, 1977. She was the youngest of 4 children and the only daughter of Jack Roger Dodge and Carol Dodge. Angie was a force to be reckoned with from the very beginning, and those who knew her couldn't help but be struck by her intelligence, stubbornness, and no-nonsense attitude. As her best friend, Jessica Martinez, put it, she didn't put up with people's crap. As May of 1996 rolled around, Angie found herself at a crossroads. She was 18, fresh out of Idaho Falls School, and itching for independence. She was determined to start the next chapter of her life on her own terms. So during the 3rd week of the month, Angie packed her bags and moved out of her family home. She and her mother had also at some point disagreed over a house rule, and this had hastened Angie's decision to move out. Her new abode was a cozy apartment on the 2nd floor of a weathered building, located at 4441 Ice Street in Idaho Falls. Despite the inevitable challenges that come with living alone for the first time, Angie quickly settled into her new routine. By day, she worked at a beauty store in downtown Idaho Falls, where she charmed her customers with her friendly demeanor and impeccable makeup skills, and by night, she returned to her apartment, where she reveled in her newfound independence. 3 weeks had passed since Angie left her family home, but the distance between her and her mother was beginning to weigh on her. And so on the evening of June 12, 1996, Angie decided to pay her mother a visit. When Carol opened the door, Angie greeted her with a kiss, and for a moment, all the past disagreements were forgotten. Mother and daughter embraced, rocking back and forth in each other's arms. As they caught up, Angie confided in her mother the hardships of growing up and living alone. After a pleasant evening, Angie bid her mother farewell and blew her a kiss as she drove away. Little did Carol know that it would be the last time she would see her daughter alive. She had no idea of the events that were about to unfold, events that would shatter her world and leave her grieving for years to come. The morning of June 13th, 1996, began like any other day for 2 colleagues of Angie, simply identified as Julia and Tawny. A few minutes before 11 a.m., the pair arrived at Angie's apartment, concerned that she had failed to show up for her shift at the beauty store. As they knocked on her front door, a sense of unease settled over them. When Angie didn't answer, they let themselves in. The silence inside was deafening. The girls searched every room until they reached the bedroom, and that's when their worst fears were realized. Angie was lying on the floor, a blood-stained sheet covering the mattress beside her. Her throat was slit, and her body was riddled with over a dozen puncture wounds. It was a sight that no one should ever have to witness. Julia and Tawny were left reeling at the gruesome sight before them. Authorities were summoned to the scene, and soon the apartment was teeming with detectives determined to get to the bottom of the heinous crime. Despite the chaos, the detectives combed the scene with a hawkish eye, searching for clues to lead them to Angie's killer. They noticed a lack of forced entry, and this suggested that the perpetrator was probably known to Angie. They wasted no time in collecting her bedding and clothing, eager to send them off to the Idaho State Crime Lab for testing. Meanwhile, Angie's body was also taken away for an autopsy. The autopsy revealed the brutal truth about Angie's death. She had been stabbed and cut 14 times. Her killer's DNA was found on her body. Investigators were able to determine that Angie was killed between 12:45 a.m. and 11:15 a.m. on the day her lifeless body was discovered. The news of Angie's death spread like wildfire, and people were left reeling with disbelief and anger. Her family was left heartbroken and inconsolable, struggling to come to terms with the devastating loss. The question on everyone's mind was who could have committed such a heinous crime against a young, innocent woman in a town where everyone knew each other and crime was rare. This kind of violence was unprecedented. The people demanded answers, and they wanted them immediately. The Idaho Falls Police Department detectives assigned to the case didn't waste any time and immediately launched an investigation into Angie's murder. They knocked on doors and interviewed neighbors, friends, family members, and colleagues, hoping to find some information that could lead to the killer. The department also took DNA samples from dozens of men and compared it to the DNA found on the scene and on Angie's body, but there were no matches. The complexity and high-profile nature of the case seemed to overwhelm the department, and weeks after Angie's killing, there were still no clear leads. Frustration was starting to build, and the case seemed to be going nowhere. Feeling helpless and frustrated with the slow pace of the investigation, Angie's mother, Carol, decided to take matters into her own hands. She distributed thousands of flyers, offering a $5,000 reward for tips, but the response was minimal. Undeterred, she took to patrolling the streets until the early hours, asking anyone who would listen if they had information about her daughter's death. Carol was determined to find justice for her daughter, no matter what it took. The investigation into Angie's murder seemed to have hit a dead end until one day, the detectives got a break in the case. On January 5, 1997, 7 long months after Angie's murder, a man named Benjamin Hobbs was arrested. He had been caught taking advantage of a woman at knife point in Nevada, and detectives couldn't help but notice the similarities between his crime and Angie's murder. As detectives dug deeper into his background, they found out that Benjamin was also from Idaho Falls and knew Angie through a group of young people called the River Rats. This group frequently hung out by the trails along a river not far from Angie's apartment. Angie also frequented the river, and the group knew her well. With all of the pieces coming together, it wasn't long before Benjamin became the prime suspect in Angie's case. Detectives began building a case against him and even brought in another of his friends, 20-year-old Christopher Tapp, for questioning. As it happened, Tapp was Benjamin's best friend, and detectives hoped that he might be able to provide valuable information. When Tapp was interrogated on January 7, 1997, he initially denied any involvement in the crime. He told detectives he had been with a girl on the night Angie was murdered, and that Benjamin was not involved either. However, the detectives believed there was more to the story. During his second interview, just a few days later on January 10, 1997, Tapp changed his story and admitted that Benjamin had killed Angie and had asked him to provide an alibi.
The impression I got from him is you're like downstairs waiting for him. Maybe I was, I just don't know. Who's with you? Dad.
But the detectives weren't satisfied. They pushed Tapp further, and on January 15, 1997, his story took yet another turn. This time, Tapp claimed that he had been with Benjamin when Angie was killed. Between January 15th and 17th, 1997, Tapp entered into a series of immunity agreements with prosecutors. He agreed to provide truthful information about the crime in return for a lesser charge of aiding and abetting an aggravated battery. But just when the detectives thought they had cracked the case, a new development surfaced. DNA tests had come back and confirmed that neither Benjamin nor Tapp was the source of the DNA found on Angie's body and clothes. The detectives were stumped, and it was at this point that Tapp came up with a new name, Jeremy Sargis, who was a friend of both Tapp and Benjamin. Tapp now accused both Benjamin and Jeremy of Angie's murder, saying they had taken advantage of her and killed her. It seemed like the case was getting even more complicated. As the investigation dragged on, Tapp's credibility was hanging by a thread. The authorities had used every tool at their disposal, from endless interrogations to multiple lie detector tests, and now they were running out of patience. On January 27th, the DNA results on Jeremy also came back negative, proving that he had no involvement in Angie's murder. This was a major setback for the prosecution, adding insult to injury. Sargis's alibi had checked out, leaving prosecutors with no one else to turn to. In a fit of rage, prosecutors voided Tapp's immunity agreement on January 29, 1997, accusing him of being untruthful. The pressure on Tapp was mounting, and he was running out of options. To make matters worse, Tapp was taken to the crime scene on the same day, but his lawyer refused to accompany him. After the visit, Tapp changed his story once again. In this version, Tapp claimed that he had held Angie down while Benjamin and another man named Mike committed the murder. Nobody except Tapp seemed to know who this Mike was. The new revelation left the detectives scrambling to piece together a coherent narrative. It wasn't until January 30th, 1997, during another lie detector test, that Tapp finally revealed his final version of what happened. He confessed to taking part in attacking Angie, but only because Benjamin had threatened to kill him.
I know I'm there.
How many times did you cut her?
Just once.
In a shocking turn of events, on February 3rd, 1997, Tapp was charged with first-degree murder and use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. But what about Benjamin, the supposed ringleader of the crime? Despite being convicted of the unrelated Nevada crime, he was never charged in Angie's death. Meanwhile, Jeremy, who Tapp had previously accused of taking part in the crime, had been initially charged as an accessory. However, the charges were later dismissed, leaving Tapp to face the full brunt of the prosecution's case against him. The trial of Tapp began the following year in May 1998, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to witness the outcome of the highly publicized case. Tapp vehemently maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. His lawyer also pointed out that the DNA test proved he wasn't the killer. In addition to this, the lawyer tried to have Tapp's confession thrown out, arguing that it was coerced, but the judge allowed it to be admitted as evidence. To further bolster their case, prosecutors brought in a surprise witness, a young woman named Destiny Osborne. She recounted being at a party a few days after Angie was killed and overheard Tapp and Benjamin talking about the crime. Carol, Angie's mother, was a constant presence throughout the trial. She sat in the front row, listening intently to every piece of testimony. Her grief was palpable, and she was determined to see justice served. She hoped for the death penalty, believing that Tapp deserved to suffer for the pain he had inflicted on her daughter. As the trial came to a close, the jury's verdict was clear. Tapp was guilty. However, the judge decided to spare Tapp from the death penalty, instead sentencing him to 30 years to life in prison.
Jury, for verdict, unanimous, not guilty.
Despite this outcome, Carol, the mother of the victim, remained inconsolable. She glared at Tapp with disdain throughout the trial, and, as the verdict was announced, she stormed out of the courtroom in frustration. She wasn't entirely satisfied with the outcome of the trial. Despite Tapp's conviction, Carol couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to the story. She refused to believe that Tapp acted alone and was determined to uncover the truth. She knew that the DNA found at the scene didn't match Tapp's, and this only fueled her desire to find the real killer. She knew the perpetrator responsible for her daughter's death was still out there. The authorities also shared the same sentiments. Due to this, they continued to search for other possible perpetrators who might match the DNA found at the scene. As the years passed, the investigation into Angie's murder seemed to have reached a dead end. However, Carol never lost hope that the person responsible for her daughter's death would be found. In 2009, over a decade after Angie was brutally killed, the unknown killer's DNA was finally entered into a national crime database. Despite this breakthrough, there was still no match. But then, Carol received an unexpected Christmas gift, a computer. Without hesitation, she put it to good use and discovered a company in Florida that could analyze DNA samples to identify the race of the donor. The police agreed to the test, and the results showed the unknown person was 85% Caucasian. This result helped detectives know what to focus on. Despite the long wait, Carol's persistence and determination continued to fuel her search for the truth. She was determined to get the best and brightest minds involved to help find the person responsible for Angie's death. After some searching, she stumbled upon Dr. Greg Hampikin, a leading forensic DNA expert who had founded the Idaho Innocence Project, an organization dedicated to correcting and preventing wrongful convictions. At the time Carol contacted Hampikin, he was already familiar with Angie's murder case. In fact, Tapp had previously written to the Idaho Innocence Project from prison, pleading with them to investigate his conviction. With Hampikin's guidance, Carol was able to push the Idaho Falls Police Department to try a novel approach called familial DNA testing. This involved looking at the database of convicted offenders in Idaho for anyone who might be related to Angie's killer. Although this method was not allowed in Idaho, Hampikin proposed an even bolder plan, uploading the crime scene sample to public databases. To Carol's relief, the police were willing to give this idea a shot. In the summer of 2014, detectives searched the public DNA database owned by Ancestry.com and finally got a hit. The DNA match was Michael Ursey Sr., whose Y DNA closely matched the perpetrators on 34 out of 35 STR markers. Although it was not a definitive match, it was close enough to make detectives believe they had found a relative of Angie's killer. Detectives shifted their focus to investigating Michael Ursey Sr.'s family members, and his son, named Michael Ursey Jr., soon caught their attention. Could this be the same Mike that Tapp once mentioned during his interrogation back in 1997? The detectives delved deeper into the younger Ursey's background, and they discovered he was a filmmaker living in New Orleans. His work included a dark movie called Murder Abelia, which dealt with the murder of a young woman. Due to Michael's macabre, cinematic taste, the detectives began to suspect that he might have been involved in Angie's murder. In December 2014, over 18 years after Angie's murder, Michael was arrested. Detectives from Idaho Falls and a Louisiana State police officer took Michael to a police office near the New Orleans Superdome and began interrogating him. During the interrogation, the detectives found out that Michael had friends in Idaho and had been in the area at the time of the murder. This was a crucial piece of information that raised suspicions. Following this, detectives then swabbed Michael's cheek for DNA and drove him home. Michael was now their prime suspect, but would the DNA match what was found at the crime scene? They did not have to wait too long for the answer, because weeks later, it was discovered that his DNA did not match the crime scene sample. This news was a huge blow to the detectives working on the case. It seemed as if they were back to square one once again. However, they refused to give up on this new method of familial DNA testing that had brought them so close to the truth. They were more determined than ever to keep digging and uncover any lead, no matter how small it might seem. They knew that solving this case would bring long-awaited justice to Angie and her family, and they were not going to let it go cold again. While all this was going on, Carol was in a state of confusion. She wanted justice for her daughter, and despite her doubts about Tap, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. In fact, a year before Michael Ursi's involvement in the case, she had immersed herself in 60 hours of interrogation footage from Tap's case. From watching the footage, she uncovered a series of troubling inconsistencies in his story that left her with nagging doubts. Carol wasn't about to let Tap remain behind bars if he truly was innocent, so she contacted Tap's defense attorney, John Thomas, and shared her doubts about his guilt. Thomas was intrigued and wanted to help. He joined forces with Carol and enlisted the expertise of Stephen Dreisen, a renowned expert of false confessions. As Dreisen reviewed the interrogation tapes, he couldn't shake the feeling that Tap had been manipulated into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. Then, he uncovered a damning truth. Tap had been coerced with the threat of the death penalty during his interrogation in 1997. The police had played a dangerous game, dangling Tap's life in front of him to extract a confession. Dreisen quickly got to work, compiling a report that detailed the coercive tactics used by the police. In his report, Dreisen also concluded that there was no evidence that Tap was at the crime scene or that he participated in the murder. Following this, Dreisen contacted the Innocence Project of New York, recruiting them to work alongside the Idaho Innocence Project and Judges for Justice. Together they launched a massive effort to secure Tap's release from prison. The winds of change were blowing as Tap's case gradually took an unprecedented turn. In 2015, the prosecutor's office hired an independent investigator to review Tap's conviction. The investigator's findings shook the very foundation of Tap's conviction. He discovered that the information Tap had stated during his interrogation had been fed to him by law enforcement officials. Even the polygrapher's statement during the polygraph examinations were found to be coercive in nature. Despite this, the investigator believed that Tap had been present during the attack and murder of Angie, but questioned Tap's confession about being personally involved in the crime. May 2016 was a pivotal moment for Tap as his attorneys filed a motion for post-conviction relief, claiming that his confession was coerced and deceptive. They hoped that new DNA evidence would clear his name, but the prosecutor wasn't willing to budge. Not until Carol, Tap's lawyers, and the community came together in a powerful display of solidarity. They demanded justice for Tap, and their voices grew too loud to ignore. Finally, County Prosecutor Daniel Clark made an offer. Tap would be released from prison, but he would have to live with the convictions on his record and be placed on parole for at least a decade. It was a tempting offer, but Tap refused. He was determined to clear his name and prove his innocence, no matter the cost. After much deliberation, Tap's defense attorney, John Thomas, was able to convince the prosecutor to agree to a new deal. This time, Tap would be allowed to walk free after serving 20 years in prison. He would lose the abuse charge, but would keep the murder charge, and if the real killer was ever found, Tap would be exonerated. It was a tough decision, but Tap accepted the deal. In a shocking turn of events, Destiny Osborne, the surprise witness who had once claimed to have heard Tap confess to the murder, recanted her testimony, accusing the police of pressuring her to falsely implicate Tap. Her admission added to the mounting evidence of coercion and deceit that surrounded Tap's case, and raised even more questions about the veracity of his conviction. Finally, on March 22, 2017, Tapp walked out of prison as a free man. But even with his newfound freedom, he still carried the weight of being a convicted murderer. Worst of all, the real killer of Angie was still at large, and this left the community on edge and desperate for answers. In the summer of 2017, the Idaho Falls Police Department underwent some major changes with the appointment of a new police chief, Bryce Johnson, and the refreshing of the Investigations Bureau. One of the officers selected to lead the bureau was Bill Squires, who had been a rookie cop at the time of Angie's murder and had assisted with the crime scene investigation. The bureau began putting in more effort to crack the case once and for all. Meanwhile, Carol heard about genetic genealogy and the groundbreaking work being done at Parabon Nanolabs. She was determined to explore this avenue for her daughter's case and contacted the chief genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore. However, the DNA evidence in Angie's case was severely degraded, and Parabon initially turned down the request. But Carol was not one to give up easily, and she personally appealed to Moore to take on the case. Moved by Carol's persistence and dedication, Moore eventually agreed to help and began working with the police on Angie's case in the fall of 2018. Despite this seemingly impossible task of deciphering the DNA evidence, Moore was not deterred. She began building family trees of people who shared DNA with the unknown suspect. Moore's investigation eventually led her to one marriage that dated back to the 1800s, and she soon established that the suspect had to be the grandson or great-grandson of a man called Clarence Ussery. Through birth certificates and obituaries, she identified 6 men who were the right age to have committed the crime in 1996, with one of them living in Idaho. Moore handed the names over to the Idaho Falls Police Department, who then needed to obtain DNA samples of the 6 men. After days of tailing the suspects, the police were able to secretly acquire the samples, but to their dismay, none of the suspects matched the DNA found at the crime scene. Despite this setback, Moore refused to accept defeat and went back to the drawing board. She had examined the family tree she had constructed, trying to identify any potential cracks in the genealogical branches. She knew that the tree may be incomplete, with missing branches due to marriages, divorces, and adoptions that were not documented. After days of painstaking research, she discovered a critical piece of information in an obituary that would lead to a breakthrough. The obituary revealed that a woman named Helen Darnell had a daughter named Linda Darnell, who was previously married to a member of the Ursi family named Philip. Following their divorce, Linda gave birth to a son named Brian Dripps, who was raised with his stepfather's surname. And with this, Moore knew she had finally found the missing link to the family tree. When Moore shared Dripps' name with the investigators on May 1, 2019, they were in disbelief. Not only did Dripps live in Idaho Falls at the time of the murder, but he resided right across the street from Angie's house. The police had even contacted him during their initial investigations, but had not noticed anything suspicious about him. It was clear that they had missed a vital piece of the puzzle. As they delved deeper, they discovered that Dripps had left Idaho Falls just 7 weeks after the murder. The timing was too coincidental, and it seemed like he was trying to cover his tracks. In May 2019, detectives journeyed to Caldwell, Idaho to investigate Dripps. They were eager to gather DNA evidence to confirm their suspicions. However, this task proved to be more challenging than they expected. In the first hour of watching him, Dripps carelessly tossed a cigarette butt out of his car window. An officer raced to retrieve it from the busy road, but it was lost among dozens of other cigarette butts. The police had to keep watching him for another 24 hours before they got another chance. Finally, on the afternoon of May 10th, 2019, detectives witnessed Dripps throwing another cigarette butt out of his car window. Once he had driven off, an undercover officer rushed into the busy road to retrieve it, while other officers blocked cars from injuring the detective. The cigarette butt was successfully recovered and immediately sent for testing. When the test results came back, the detectives were thrilled to learn that it was a match. Dripps was the killer. The case had finally been solved, and justice for Angie Dodge was within reach. On May 15, 2019, the long-awaited breakthrough in the case occurred when 53-year-old Dripps was arrested and charged with her murder. In a police interrogation, Dripps was confronted with the DNA evidence and eventually admitted to the heinous crime. According to him, he had gone alone to Angie's apartment with the intention of taking advantage of her, but had not planned to kill her. He also claimed he didn't know Tapp, who was previously convicted of the crime. Finally, justice was served for Tapp as well, when his murder conviction was nullified and he was exonerated on July 17, 2019. However, the trauma of spending years in prison for a crime he did not commit left him scarred, and he filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Idaho Falls and 7 former Idaho Falls Police Department officers in December of that year. On February 9, 2021, Dripps pleaded guilty to the murder of Angie. The prosecution and defense came to an agreement that Dripps would serve life in prison with the possibility of parole after at least 20 years. But both parties knew that due to his failing health, 20 years was essentially a life sentence for Dripps. He would likely die in prison. On June 7, 2022, the sentence was handed down, and Dripps was officially condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars. Before the verdict, Dripps stood up at the defense table, his voice barely above a whisper, and apologized. He expressed his remorse for what he had done, saying, "I wish I could do over that night." It was a small comfort for those who had suffered so much in the wake of Angie's death. But the story didn't end there. In June 2022, officials announced that they had agreed to pay $11.7 million to Tapp. The payout was a small consolation for the years he lost, but it was a step towards making things right. It was also a reminder that justice, although delayed, can still be served. And that's the conclusion of the tragic and complicated case of Angie Dodge's murder. From the initial arrest of Tapp to the eventual conviction of Dripps, this case had been marked by twists and turns, wrongful accusations, and long overdue justice. It's a case that has left a lasting impact on the community of Idaho Falls and the broader public, highlighting both the importance and fallibility of DNA evidence in criminal investigations. As we reflect on this case, we are left with a question: how can we continue to improve our justice system to ensure that the guilty are held accountable, while also preventing wrongful convictions that can cause so much harm? Donna Dee Macho's journey began on October 16, 1964, in the town of East Windsor, nestled within Mercer County. She was the cherished daughter of Betty Lou Thompson Macho and Ronald Wayne Macho. As the years went by, Donna's family expanded with the arrival of her younger sister, Julie Macho, in 1969. Life took a turn when their mother, Betty, found love again and married a man named Garland. Together they formed a blended family. Donna and Julie embraced their new life with their beloved stepfather by their side. Donna Macho had a zest for life that radiated through her love for cooking and sewing. Alongside her job as a legal secretary, she harbored dreams of a career in modeling. For Julie, Donna was a shining star. Despite the challenges that came her way, Donna never lost her sparkle and continued to embrace life with open arms. Little did she know that her path would take an unexpected and tragic turn, forever altering the lives of those who cherished her. On February 25, 1984, it seemed like a typical Saturday night for 14-year-old Julie Macho, who was relaxing at her family's home in East Windsor. When she noticed her 19-year-old sister, Donna Dee Macho's car parked outside, she joined her in the basement. Together they spent the night watching scary movies until 2 a.m. At that point, Julie went upstairs to her bed, ready to rest for the night. Their mother Betty and stepfather Garland were peacefully asleep upstairs during that time. They were unaware of any unusual sounds or disturbances emanating from the basement. The following day, on February 26, 1984, Donna was expected to go to work at a law firm, so her absence during the day didn't initially raise alarm bells. However, as dinner time arrived and Donna still hadn't returned home, her mother began to worry. Concerned for her daughter's well-being, Betty decided to investigate by venturing downstairs to check the basement apartment. As Betty entered Donna's usually neat and organized apartment, she was greeted by a disarray of items scattered about. It was evident that a struggle had taken place within those walls. The sight of blood-stained clothes heaped together heightened her growing unease, prompting her to immediately contact the police. Once the police arrived at the scene, they meticulously combed through the entire basement, their eyes keenly scanning for any trace that could unravel the mystery. Their diligence paid off when they discovered faint fingerprints near a table close to the bed. Recognizing the potential significance of these fingerprints, they carefully collected them as evidence, alongside the blood-stained clothes. They also uncovered traces of bodily fluid in the bedroom, an essential clue that held the promise of leading them closer to the identity of the perpetrator and help in finding Donna. In the search for answers, investigators made a grim discovery. In March 1984, when they found Donna Macho's abandoned blood-stained car near a sewer plant roughly a mile away from her home. However, despite this lead, the mystery surrounding her disappearance endured. Investigators meticulously combed through countless records. They diligently interviewed the residents living in the vicinity of Donna Macho's residence, determined to unearth any clue that could lead them to the truth. As fate would have it, the investigation took a significant turn when they suspected a number of people, including Nathaniel Harvey, a former worker at a nearby farm and resident of East Windsor. He had been apprehended and detained for his alleged involvement in a series of assaults and a chilling murder in the Plainsboro area. But all the leads, including Harvey, did not pan out at that time. The significant piece of evidence, the bodily fluid that investigators found in Donna Macho's bedroom, also went for testing. However, the technology for DNA testing was not as advanced as it is today, and the testing conducted at that time lacked the precision needed to pinpoint the source of the bodily fluid. But the investigators didn't close the case and hoped that one day they would come up with some solid leads that would help them solve Donna Macho's murder mystery. The weight of the tragedy became too much for Donna's stepfather, who tragically passed away just 6 months after Donna vanished, leaving the family to bear the weight of their grief alone. The family went to great lengths in their search for the killer. They hired private investigators, trackers, and even sought the help of psychics. They poured all their resources into the effort, spending every last penny they had. Their hope never wavered. They held on to the belief that somehow, maybe, just maybe, their loved one was still alive. They couldn't shake the thought that perhaps she was injured. After exhausting all possible avenues to finding the identity of the killer, seeking solace and a fresh start, Julie and her mother made the difficult decision to move to Texas in 1987. However, their journey to healing was further marred by misfortune, when their storage unit was burglarized, robbing them of precious memories. The thieves callously snatched away family photos, cherished mementos, and 16 boxes filled with investigation files, adding another layer of pain. 11 years went by, but there was no news. But on April 2, 1995, police officers got a call from a Boy Scout troop about a body they found near Cranberry. It was not in good condition, almost completely decomposed, but when they got the dental records back, they couldn't believe they had found the most important part of the puzzle they had been searching for the last decade. It was the body of Donna Dee Macho, concealed within a carpet in a wooded area near a cranberry farm, not far from where her car had been recovered. After her remains were sent for an autopsy, initial findings indicated that Donna had tragically suffered a gunshot wound to the head. However, as the case investigation progressed, the dedicated experts at the Middle Assault Regional Medical Examiner's Office delved deeper into her remains. Through careful examination, they discovered that her cause of death was indeed a head injury, although it couldn't be definitively determined as a gunshot wound. Nevertheless, the cause of death was amended to evidence of homicidal violence, and her death continued to be classified as a homicide. With this crucial lead unable to yield conclusive results, the investigation gradually reached a standstill, and the case eventually fell into the abyss of unsolved mysteries. In February 2022, Mercer County Prosecutor Angelo Onofre directed the reopening of the Donna Macho case. The case was handed over to the Office of Public Integrity and Accountability Central Regional Cold Case Task Force, a dedicated group within the statewide cold case network established by the New Jersey Attorney General in 2019. As part of the reopened investigation, all relevant physical evidence, including DNA samples, was carefully resubmitted to the state police's Central Regional Laboratory. This step aimed to leverage advanced forensic techniques and technology in the pursuit of truth and justice. Modern DNA technology played a crucial role in shedding new light on the case. The evidence, the bodily fluid which was found from Donna Macho's bedroom, was carefully re-examined, and it conclusively matched the DNA profile to Nathaniel Harvey. Astonishingly, his DNA was the only genetic material found in the room that should not have been present, according to the Attorney General's office. It was a breakthrough that provided clarity and closure to the long-standing mystery. Nathaniel Harvey, born in 1942 in East Windsor, had a troubled past right from the beginning. He had a knack for trouble and found himself behind bars for most of his life. In 1968, he got married, but the identity of his wife is not known. Living in East Windsor, Harvey had a long list of crimes to his name. He was also described as a daring intruder by the West Windsor police, and he had been convicted of assault. It was said that during his crimes, Harvey would sneak into unlocked homes, where he would take young women hostage and commit acts of violence. The authorities always had their eyes on him, considering him a potential suspect in their search for justice. One such case was of Irene Schnapps, who was also a resident of East Windsor. During the years of 1984 and 1985, the local authorities were faced with a growing concern as a series of burglaries rattled Plainsboro, West Windsor, and nearby neighborhoods. The authorities were also grappling with the unsolved murder of Irene Schnapps and the perplexing disappearance of Donna Macho, who vanished from her family's East Windsor home. 16 months after Donna Macho's disappearance, tragedy struck again in East Windsor when Irene Schnapps, a 37-year-old woman who had recently lost her husband to cancer, was killed. The incident occurred overnight on Saturday, June 15, 1985, or in the early hours of the following day. Concerned for her well-being, one of Irene's colleagues at RCA Americom went to her apartment the next morning on June 16, 1985, on Research Way after she failed to show up for work. With trembling hands, he informed the police about the tragic scene that he had encountered. Inside the apartment, a heart-wrenching sight awaited the investigators. Irene Schnapp suffered a barrage of over 15 vicious blows to her head, inflicted by an axe or hatchet. The room bore gruesome evidence of the tragedy, with Irene's lifeless body lying unclothed in her blood-soaked bedroom. Amidst the chilling scene, a crimson-stained footprint on a pillowcase was discovered, becoming a vital clue that held the potential to unlock the mystery behind her tragic demise. Peter Stowasser, a 41-year-old man, stepped forward to share his account with the investigators. As a friendly acquaintance of Irene Schnapp's, he revealed that he may have been the last person to have seen her alive. Shortly after sharing his connection to Irene Schnapp's, Stowasser's life took an unexpected turn. The police began frequent visits to his doorstep, and one Saturday, June 17, 1985, Stowasser found himself taken to the Middle Assault Prosecutor's Office, where he spent the entire day under intense scrutiny, facing a barrage of questions regarding Irene's tragic murder. He confessed to developing feelings of attraction towards her, envisioning a potential romantic connection. However, Irene, still grieving the loss of her husband, expressed the need for time and space before considering any new relationships. As Stowasser eagerly anticipated the right moment to express his romantic feelings, he maintained a friendly connection with Irene. He extended invitations to his lively gatherings, hosting barbecues for neighbors and friends in an effort to ensure she didn't feel alone. However, their potential relationship was abruptly shattered when Irene met her tragic end, casting suspicion upon Stowasser as the primary suspect. Law enforcement also obtained a search warrant for Stowasser's residence. During the search, they discovered a quilt that bore suspicious-looking stains, possibly blood-related. Additionally, from his car, investigators seized a pair of white work gloves and a metal strip exhibiting reddish spots. Upon conducting tests on the quilt, it was revealed to contain human blood, accompanied by hairs that seemed to match those of the victim. Stowasser, however, maintained that the stains on the quilt originated from menstrual blood belonging to another woman he was involved with. As the investigation progressed, Stowasser underwent a lie detector test, which he did not pass, although the results of such tests were not considered admissible in court. Additionally, it came to light that he had a history of serving time in jail for stalking a former girlfriend. However, the police eventually eliminated Stowasser as a primary suspect, largely due to a significant discrepancy in shoe sizes. Stowasser wore size 12 shoes, whereas a bloody footprint at the crime scene indicated a size 6 shoe. This unexpected mismatch in foot size shifted the focus of the investigation elsewhere. However, on October 28, 1985, the breakthrough in the case occurred. On that very day, Nathaniel Harvey embarked on a rampage through the southern part of West Windsor, ultimately leading to a significant turning point in the investigation. The initial call that reached the dispatch center reported an alarming incident in Dutch Neck Estates. It was a chilling account of a 13-year-old girl who had narrowly escaped an attempted abduction from her own home, and the man covered her mouth in an attempt to take her away. However, her bravery prevailed as she managed to free herself and let out a piercing scream, alerting her parents to the danger. Startled by the commotion, he fled the scene. After fleeing the home in Dutch Neck Estates, that man broke into another house, probably to hide from the police. He was confronted by the homeowner. He turned on the light and saw Nathaniel Harvey standing there threatening him with an axe. Sensing the imminent danger, Harvey swiftly pivoted, shattering the glass door with a powerful swing of the axe, and ran off into the woods. With a chilling affinity for axes, Harvey had developed a disturbing pattern of wielding these menacing tools to instill fear in his victims. Even when armed with a knife during one of the assaults he committed, he deceitfully claimed to possess an axe, further fueling the terror. It wasn't lost on the astute law enforcement officials that the murder weapon used in the Irene Schnapp's killing was believed to be an axe, adding another haunting connection to Harvey's modus operandi. A short time later, investigators diligently canvassed the area, and their sharp eyes caught sight of Harvey traversing a soybean field, and then ran off into the woods. The police swiftly descended upon the scene, converging on Harvey's location near the Princeton Arms shopping center. It was there at the intersection of Old Trenton Road and Dorchester Drive that a state trooper apprehended Harvey. During questioning, police learned of the extent of Harvey's one-man crime spree. He confessed to a string of burglaries that had struck fear into the community. However, the extent of his depravity became even more harrowing as it revealed the details of a recent assault. Prior to the tragic murder of Irene, Harvey had abducted a young girl from East Windsor, forcefully taking her to an abandoned building nestled along Dutch Neck Road. He revealed that the victim, who was actually Donna Macho, innocently stepped out onto her deck to indulge in a cigarette, only to be seized by his relentless grip. After Harvey's arrest, the 13-year-old girl was called to identify if Harvey was the man who attacked her on October 28, 1985. Through her courageous testimony, she ultimately identified Harvey as her assailant. The authorities made a difficult decision not to pursue charges in the case due to the extremely brutal and perverse nature of the attack, considering the potential impact it would have on the victim's well-being. However, a breakthrough came when investigators finally received the search warrant and conducted a thorough search of Harvey's car in November 1985, which was located in the Princeton Arms apartment complex. Inside, they uncovered compelling evidence directly linking him to the Irene Schnapp's murder. Alongside stolen items from various recent burglaries, a significant discovery was made: a Seiko watch that was positively identified as belonging to Irene and having been taken from her apartment at the time of the tragic murder. This crucial find provided a solid connection between Harvey and the crime. In an intriguing twist, it was discovered that Harvey's wife resided in the same apartment complex as Irene. However, this information had to be kept confidential due to his wife's reliance on state assistance. Additionally, authorities asserted that Harvey initially admitted to the murder of Irene during his questioning at the West Windsor Police Headquarters, where he was confronted with various matters. It was during this intense moment that Harvey requested to speak with his father, who offered him crucial advice to do the right thing. In a surprising turn of events, Harvey then made a confession regarding the Irene Schnapp's murder. Following Harvey's apprehension, the quilt that had been seized from Stowasser, the neighbor of Irene, who was also seen as a person of interest in the murder, was returned to him. Additionally, the glove and metal strip confiscated from his car underwent testing by prosecutors, revealing negative results for the presence of blood. In 1986, Harvey was convicted for the murder of Irene Schnapp. However, 4 years later in 1990, the state Supreme Court overturned his conviction, stating that his confession had been obtained without properly informing him of his Miranda rights. Harvey, who now maintained that his confession was coerced, immediately retracted his statement. This turn of events raised concerns about the validity of his initial confession and ignited a debate about whether he should have been reminded of his Miranda rights after speaking with his father. The question of Harvey's confession became a point of contention as conflicting accounts emerged. According to Evan Kleiner, the attorney of Harvey, he denied confessing to the murder of Irene, contradicting the police's assertion that he had admitted to the crime, even though the confession was not recorded. the initial conviction was overturned, based on the court's ruling that Harvey should have been reminded of his Miranda rights after requesting to speak to his father during questioning. In 1994, as the case went to a second trial, the focus shifted to the crucial evidence of blood found at the crime scene. The prosecution presented DNA evidence that revealed genetic traits matching both Harvey's blood sample and the stains on a box spring in Irene Schnapp's apartment. The DNA testing, although still in its early stages, indicated that Harvey could not be ruled out as a contributor. To further strengthen their case, prosecution experts utilized dot intensity analysis, a technique that estimated the consistency between the blood characteristics found at the scene and Harvey's DNA. They determined that such a match would occur in only 1 out of every 1,400 African American individuals. However, the defense experts countered, arguing that the ratio could potentially be as low as 1 in 50. This time, Harvey was convicted and received the death sentence. However, this verdict was upheld by a divided state Supreme Court in 1997, with some justices expressing differing views. Justice Alan B. Handler, in his dissenting opinion, carefully scrutinized the 64-page analysis of the DNA testing presented in the case. He voiced his doubts and expressed confidence that at some point in the future, either the state or federal court would likely reverse the decision. In a surprising turn of events, according to an article in the New York Times on May 15, 2005, Kleiner, the attorney of Harvey, pointed a finger of accusation at Peter Stowasser, a former neighbor of Irene. Although Stowasser was once considered a possible suspect by the police, he was subsequently ruled out. Kleiner implicated Stowasser, who was now 61 years old and residing in Hightstown, in both the Irene case and the murder of Donna Macho from East Windsor, who went missing in 1984 and whose body was discovered in 1995. These claims made by Kleiner garnered significant attention, making headlines in the New Jersey section of the Sunday New York Times. He also strongly disputed the accuracy of the blood DNA evidence presented during Harvey's second trial, claiming it to be flawed and contaminated. Additionally, he demanded further DNA testing on other pieces of evidence collected in the case, suggesting that they could have implicated Stowasser instead. Kleiner raised concerns about missing evidence, including the absence of hair from the quilt. He expressed suspicion regarding the classification of the retrieved hair, noting that it was initially labeled as Caucasian and later had the phrase, "and one Negroid hair." Kleiner alleged that all the hair evidence, technician's notes, and microfilm have mysteriously vanished, leading him to believe that the hair evidence never actually existed. Capsack, who continued to serve as a prosecutor in Middle Assault County, expressed unwavering confidence in Harvey's conviction, firmly asserting that Stowasser played no part in the crime. According to Capsack, Stowasser was initially considered as a possible suspect in the case, but he was ultimately eliminated as a prime suspect. The decisive factor was the discovery of a size 6 bloody sneaker print on the victim's pillow, which contradicted Stowasser's size 12 foot. Interestingly, the article failed to mention that Harvey himself wore a size 6 sneaker. However, he clarified that Stowasser's involvement was merely circumstantial and not indicative of his guilt. In April 2007, Judge John F. Malone of the State Superior Court made a decision that dashed Harvey's hopes for a new evidentiary hearing and dismissed his habeas corpus challenge. He overturned Harvey's 1994 conviction, originally a death sentence, due to inadequate legal assistance provided to him during the early 1990s. Despite this development, Harvey, 65 years old, would still serve a 70-year sentence for a separate charge. The death sentence he received in 1994 had been reduced to life in prison without parole when New Jersey abolished capital punishment in 2007. Prior to this abolition, Harvey had spent 20 years on death row, although the state had not carried out an execution since 1963. However, late in November 2020, Harvey died in the State Woods State Prison in Bridgeton, which eventually closed all the doors of any further investigation. Peter Stowasser was considered a suspect in the murder of Donna Macho. The remains of Macho were found in 1995, approximately a mile away from the location of the Irene crime scene. It was claimed that Macho and Stowasser were both enrolled in classes at Mercer County College during the fall of 1983. It was pointed out that after Macho went missing, Stowasser did not attend the spring session classes that he had previously registered for. However, Stowasser maintains that although he attended Mercer County College, he had no knowledge of Macho or any connection to her. Harvey also was connected to Donna Macho, as the discovery of Donna's remains was in a wooded area near the farm where Harvey had briefly been employed, which raised suspicion. Adding to the puzzle was the finding of her abandoned car near a sewer plant conveniently within walking distance of Harvey's residence. These curious circumstances were enough for authorities to focus their attention on Harvey, exploring the possibility of his involvement in the case. Finally, in the last week of April 2023, New Jersey Attorney General Matthew J. Platkin announced that the conclusive identification as the person responsible for the assault and murder of Donna Macho. The state's Attorney General said the case was finally cracked when investigators took a fresh look at this decades-old mystery. Colonel Patrick Callahan, superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, said that as 4 decades have passed, the memory of a young life cruelly taken away still lingers, haunting the hearts of those who loved her. The predator responsible callously discarded her remains in a shallow grave, leaving them undisturbed for over a decade. However, time cannot extinguish the burning desire for justice. Even though the perpetrator met his fate behind bars, serving time for another heinous crime, and ultimately passing away in 2020, it does not diminish the significance of this long-awaited resolution. We commend the relentless efforts of the Central Regional Cold Case Task Force and the dedicated state police forensic scientists who hopefully have brought a modicum of solace to the victim's grieving family after all these years. The determination and dedication of law enforcement and forensic experts serve as a reminder that the pursuit of justice knows no time limit. North Miami is a suburban city located in northeast Miami-Dade County, Florida, United States. It has a population of just over 60,000 people. During the 1950s and 1960s, North Miami had a notable presence of organized crime, including various mafia families operating in the area. The mafia, also known as La Casa Nostra, established a significant influence on the city's underworld during this period. And it was during this era that the DiMares were also flourishing in North Miami. Born in 1910, Joseph J. DiMare grew up in Boston with his younger brothers, Dominic and Joseph. He and his brothers shared a close-knit bond, which continued into their lives as adults. In 1928, the 3 brothers started a business selling fresh produce. They started with a pushcart and later opened a store in Boston. Their sales grew, and they moved to a bigger location in Quincy Market in 1930. By 1939, their business expanded nationally. The DiMare brothers formed partnerships with tomato growers in different states like Florida, Texas, and California to meet the needs of supermarket chains. They were also the first in New England to import tomatoes directly from Cuba, ensuring a year-round supply for their customers. As their business thrived, the brothers decided to invest in farming. They started planting tomatoes in open packing operations in Florida and later in California. They expanded to other locations like South Carolina. In 1937, Joseph married Josephine, who was just 2 years younger than him. In the early 1940s, Joseph, Josephine, and their 3 children, Joseph Jr., James, and Richard, moved from Boston to North Miami, where Joseph and his brothers had built their livelihood by selling fresh produce. Joseph DiMare lived in Miami Beach before moving to Keystone Island in North Miami. In 1953, Joseph's only daughter Linda was born. Unfortunately, his beloved wife Josephine passed away from breast cancer soon after in 1956. 3 years later, in 1959, Joseph DiMare married Frances, a woman 20 years younger than him. In the late 1950s, winter farming meant lighting kerosene lamps and placing them between rows of tomato plants to ward off the frost. Richard remembered his father waking them and then leading them to the fields to ensure their crops didn't freeze. Joseph and his 3 sons would drive into farms and work on the tomato plants before they were sent off to processing. In March 1961, 21-year-old Richard traveled to Ohio to meet with his brothers and business partners to discuss the possibility of his Frances and Joseph getting a divorce and to update his 52-year-old father's will. His stepmother Frances was not living with them at the time. Joseph DiMare ran various aspects of the business from Miami and frequently traveled across the United States and Latin America. In 1961, he and his new wife Frances lived in the Keystone Point home, along with Joseph's daughter, while his sons lived on the family's farm in Bradenton. But what was about to take place was something none of them could have ever expected. It was a cold winter night in Bradenton on March 24, 1961, and at 3 a.m. Richard and his 2 brothers were fast asleep on their father's farm. But at the same time, the police received a frantic call from Frances DiMare, who told them a horrifying tale. She said that she and Joseph had gone out for dinner from their Keystone Point home. Frances had taken the wheel of their Cadillac Fleetwood, and Joseph sat next to her as they left for dinner. They stopped at an intersection near the south exit of Keystone Point, just west of the Broad Causeway. Suddenly, 2 men jumped into their car, causing chaos. One of the men forcefully held a gun to the back of Frances's head, making her drive to an empty lot in Sans Souci Estates. Joseph turned to look and was violently struck in the face with the pistol. Frances screamed and also got hit. Frances was knocked unconscious when she was hit with the gun. When she woke up, she found Joseph dead in the seat beside her, and the murderers had fled. In a moment of panic, she raced through the brambles and bushes to a nearby Phillips 66 service station. It was from there that she called the police. Patrolman Ben Scola of the North Miami Police Department arrived at the scene as the first officer. He observed Frances at the gas station, noting that she didn't appear severely injured. There are scratches on her face, and some specks of blood can be seen on her dress. The scratches seem self-inflicted, as if she ran her hands down her face. Frances informed him that she was knocked out or rendered unconscious and unable to witness the shooting. During the investigation, shell casings were discovered in the back seat of the Cadillac. Upon closer examination of photographs, it became apparent that there were at least 2 unspent rounds on the back seat as well. According to police records, Norman Logan, an employee of the gas station, stated that Frances never mentioned her husband being shot until the arrival of the police. 2 nearby fishermen claimed they didn't hear anything during the incident. Frances informed the police that the assailants took jewelry worth $5,000 from her and $400 in cash from her husband. However, despite the robbery, a gold ring and diamond cufflinks were still found on her husband's body. A day after the murder and robbery, according to the Miami Herald, it was reported that Frances said the gunman forcefully took her jewelry. Despite being ordered not to turn around, she disobeyed, and one of the bandits struck her with his pistol, causing her to lose consciousness. However, to the police earlier, she said that her husband had turned around. The article went on to say that upon regaining consciousness several minutes later, Frances discovered that the attackers had fled, and her husband was slumped against the car door, with blood flowing from his head. Overwhelmed with panic, she swiftly made her way through the brambles, bushes, and sharp rocks to a nearby Phillips 66 service station, where she called the police for assistance. During a subsequent interview with the Miami Herald, conducted after the murder, Frances revealed that the assailants referred to her husband as Frank instead of Joe for some unknown reason. She speculated that they may have mistaken Joe for someone else. This information was also not given to the police when they had spoken to her about the murder. Other news reports from the time stated that Frances recounted how the gunman violently struck her with the pistol when she became hysterical as they attempted to take her jewelry. This caused her to lose consciousness, and upon waking up, she discovered that her husband had been shot. The hysterical part here was again not mentioned to the police in the interview they had conducted with Frances. In another article published by the Herald, it was mentioned that Frances reached the gas station and informed Norman Logan, the owner's son, that the two men had entered the car, one in the back and one in the front. But when the police arrived at the gas station on the night of the murder, Norman had made it clear to them that Frances had not mentioned the murder until their arrival. There were many discrepancies in the way that Frances was explaining the shootout in the murder scene. Was this because she was under pressure from someone? While all this was happening, Joseph's brothers weren't in the picture at all. Were they hiding something? The passing of Joseph meant that the DiMare business would only be divided between the two remaining brothers, a motive the police looked at closely at the time. Frances wasn't done yet, though. She proceeded to provide an exclusive interview to the Herald, again in the same week, where she recounted the events again. This time she explained that as they approached the Causeway Bayshore intersection, two men suddenly entered the back seat of the car. A car was trailing behind, but there was no other traffic on the causeway. Frances was at the wheel, and one of the men held a pistol to the back of her head, telling her to follow their instructions precisely. They directed her to continue straight ahead towards Sans Souci Estates. After driving for approximately 1 block, they ordered her to make a right-hand turn off Bayshore Drive. Curiosity prompted her husband, Joe, to ask the men what they wanted. One of the assailants responded, stating their intention to obtain his money. They insisted that both Frances and Joe keep their heads facing forward, but Joe repeatedly turned back, attempting to resist them. On one occasion he turned and received a forceful blow to the face. He then turned to Frances, and she saw that he was bleeding. Shortly after he turned back again, and they struck him once more. In response, Frances began screaming. The attackers then hit her twice on the head. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the gravel outside the car. The assailants had taken all her jewelry, valued at approximately $5,000. Joe had around $400 in cash at the time, which she later discovered was also taken. Frances firmly believed that the men were not amateurs. Their composed and methodical demeanor left her convinced of their experience. Although she did not get a clear look at them, their manner of speaking did not align with that of hoodlums. Frances could not shake the thought a terrible mistake had been made, since the men referred to her husband as Frank instead of Joe for some inexplicable reason. She said that she believed that they had mistaken Joe for someone else, or perhaps their primary motive was simply robbery. She did not believe that they had any intention of causing harm. Now, in this interview, Frances logically covered all the points that did not match the statements she gave to the police in interviews she gave to newspapers. But why was she defending her statements? If she had a concussion from the blows she received on her head, it was obvious that she would not remember all the events precisely. But what was more interesting was that she was defending the assailants too, by saying that they might have mistaken Joseph for someone and their prime motive was only robbery and not murder. This led the police to theorize that the killer was maybe someone very close to Joseph and Frances. Since technology was not very evolved in those days, the police could not gather any DNA samples or even fingerprints that could help them identify the killers. There were no other clues because nobody saw the killers, and they fled before Frances gained consciousness. So the case gradually went cold. But Richard, Joseph's son, remembered that there were some tensions between Frances and Joseph before Joseph got murdered. In fact, Richard had a meeting with the other family members to discuss his father's will and also the divorce with Frances. And Frances was not living with Joseph at the time of the murder. She had left for Ohio. She had come back when she heard that Joseph had made changes to his will. His will now read that Frances would only receive part of the estate if she lived with Joseph throughout their marriage. On the day of Joseph's funeral, Richard remembered that Frances did not even shed a tear. She was as straight-faced as they come. She was more interested in doing her hair for the funeral than the funeral itself. And despite her saying that she was hit with the butt of the pistol on her forehead, there were no signs of a wound on her forehead at all. After the funeral, Frances ordered all of Joseph's children to move out within 24 hours, and Frances herself received $250,000 out of Joseph's will. And a few weeks after Joseph's funeral, Frances remarried another man. Surprisingly, this was the attorney who was going to represent Frances during her divorce proceedings. Almost 2 decades later, in the 1980s, Richard started looking into the case again with the help of an attorney and volunteer, Paul Novak. Novak was experienced with crimes happening in and around Miami. After much consideration, Novak advised Richard to send the case to a forensic scientist. Novak knew that there had been a lot of organized crime occurring in Miami in the 1960s, and there were many crimes linked to one another. So, Novak and Richard thought that this might be a mafia hit, as Joseph was a successful businessman. In 1991, almost 30 years after Joseph's death, Richard DiMare saw another perspective on the case. He reached out to John Thornton, a forensic science professor at the University of California, Berkeley, for a second opinion. After reviewing the case, Thornton wrote a letter to the Miami-Dade police expressing his doubts about Frances's statements. He found it unlikely that the situation she described matched the gunshot wounds, which seemed to have been fired from 2 different angles. Additionally, Thornton pointed out that the amount of blood discovered at the crime scene did not align with the amount of time Frances claimed the incident took. But the police could not consider it because there was no evidence. Another police officer at that time revealed that Frances could have been suspected during the initial investigation, but a high-ranking official had ordered the police to not conduct an investigation on Frances, as she was widowed in grief and also a victim. And hence the police did not further investigate the Frances angle, nor did they question her again. Then, 4 decades later in the 2000s, some officers came to Richard with a list of suspects. The police department was looking into the older cases, and Joseph's murder was one of these. These suspects were already on the list that Richard had made through his own investigations, but Frances was not on the list. In 2006, Frances DiMare died. She was 82. She had married 4 times, including her marriage to Joseph DiMare. Around 2019, almost 6 decades after Joseph DiMare's murder and 2 decades after Frances's death, the homicide squad at the cold case squad of the Miami-Dade Police Department, along with Paul Novak, started turning the pages of the Joseph DiMare cold case file again. In the old police reports, they found many clues regarding the investigation. First, after his father's murder, Richard had given some shell casings to the police. These shell casings came out of a .25 caliber SATA, an Italian auto pistol, a gun that Joseph owned but was with Frances all the time. Richard himself had fired some bullets with the gun into their house's swimming pool and had recovered the shell casings. But why did Richard give these casings to the police? Because these casings were similar to the shell casings found in the back seat of Joseph's car when he was murdered. There had been 2 empty rounds still lying there when the body was found. According to the police investigation, Joseph sustained 4 gunshot wounds. 2 bullets were fired from the front, directly into his mouth. The other 2 rounds were shot from the left side, hitting the area in front of and behind his left ear. These shots were fired from an extremely close distance, leaving traces of gunpowder around the wounds. This meant that Joseph had been killed by someone who was very close to him in terms of proximity. It also meant that the assailants weren't sitting in the back seat, as the wounds were on his mouth and around his left ear, making it clear that whoever shot him first from Joseph's left side and then also through his mouth to confirm that Joseph had died. In addition to the gunshot wounds, Joseph had 9 bruises or cuts on his head. He also had bruises on his left arm and right index finger, which meant that Joseph did struggle before he was shot or that he was dragged after he was shot. Blood was found inside the car on both the front and the back seats, as well as on the car's exterior. The blood flowed down the window and seeped out from the bottom of the door. During a re-examination in late 2019, it was reaffirmed that no blood was discovered on the driver's seat, steering wheel, or driver's door. There was also no blood splatter found beyond the center of the front seat. This meant that whoever was sitting in the driver's seat, that is Frances, was not wounded at all. On the car's exterior, streaks of blood were observed moving backward. The amount of blood indicated the seriousness of the wounds and the time it took for the bleeding to occur after the gunshot. This meant that the vehicle was moving when Joseph was shot, and it kept moving when he was bleeding. This too was contrary to what Frances had said. She had said that she went unconscious while being in the driver's seat, so the car could not have kept moving after that. No blood was discovered in Joseph's lungs. However, a slight redness was observed on his jaw. Medical experts suggested that these findings could suggest that someone had their arm around Joseph's neck when he was shot, blocking his airway. Alternatively, it could mean that the fatal shot caused an immediate stoppage of breathing. Joseph's gold ring and diamond cufflinks were still on him when he was discovered in the car, contradicting Frances's claim that it was a robbery. Two men who were fishing nearby did not hear any gunshots or any signs of a struggle or even a bullet being fired. Frances had no cuts on her feet, and her shoes were found near the car in a manner that suggested that they were deliberately placed, not scattered. When a female deputy replicated the path Frances claimed to have taken from the car to the gas station while barefoot, her feet were cut and bruised in multiple places. The initial person Frances spoke to at the gas station was Norman Logan, who reported that she never mentioned her husband being shot. But the biggest blows were yet to come. When the detectives along with Novak ran ballistic tests, they found that the trajectory of the bullets in the crime scene could only be fulfilled if the bullet was fired from the driver's end. It did not match the trajectory of the bullets mentioned by Frances in her original statements. Moreover, the shell casings that Richard gave to the police were confirmed to be the same as the shells of the bullets used to kill Joseph, meaning that Joseph was also killed by a .25 caliber SATA. The same gun had been missing from the DiMare household on the day Joseph went out with Frances for the last time. But the most revealing thing about the case reports was that a trail of blood was found from Joseph's garage, leading to the spot where Joseph's Cadillac was parked. This clearly indicated that, in fact, Joseph had been shot in his garage when he was with Frances at home before they ever left for dinner. Now, the detectives of the homicide squad, along with Novak, knew that Frances could only get Joseph's estate only if she was with him throughout their marriage. And that's what happened. Frances was with Joseph until Joseph's death, and hence she got the $250,000. The police concluded that the divorce angle and Joseph's will was reason enough for Frances to kill Joseph and get the money from him. This, along with all the obvious clues, was reason enough for the police to conclude that there was just one person who would do all this, and that was Frances DiMare. On May 10, 2023, almost 3 years after the Joseph DiMare cold case was reopened, the Miami-Dade Homicide and Cold Case Squad held a press conference.
There were concerns that she had that she would be out of the will if she wasn't living in the marital home. We know that she wasn't in Miami prior to the homicide, and that when she found that out, she did travel back.
In that, they announced that they had reason enough to believe that Frances DiMare killed Joseph DiMare. The motive for her killing was the impending divorce and Joseph changing the will. The way she did it was by shooting Joseph in their house's garage, then driving the car to another spot, 3 or 4 miles ahead, then walking barefoot to the gas station and calling the police, while leaving Joseph's body in the car itself. The police also believed that the .25 caliber SATA gun was thrown by Frances below an underbridge, and hence the murder weapon was never found. After this announcement, Richard, who was 82 now, said that he was relieved, but he was not happy at all. He knew his stepmother was the killer. Richard also revealed that in 1961, he had told the police to investigate Frances, and she was the killer, and the police had refused to do so.
There were a lot of problems. My stepmother had left the house 3 times. I told them in 1961 that my stepmother was the shooter. And they said, "Oh no, Mr. DiMare, she's not the shooter." I'm relieved on one side, but the pain and suffering that my family suffered, I don't know that that's ever going to go away.
Frances passing away in 2006 meant there was no way for her to answer for her crime. She had lived a full life without ever being held accountable for her actions. Novak said that this case was just a prime example of how politics can overshadow justice. The high-ranking official who ordered the police to leave Frances alone still remains unknown. The DiMare company since has grown a lot, spreading internationally, On their websites, they mention that the DiMare companies continue to uphold the values of hard work, integrity, and excellence established by the brothers. They believe that their determination and perseverance live on through future generations of the DiMare family and their dedicated employees. Richard was also influenced by these values and continued to seek justice for his father. And despite the fact that his stepmother will never see justice, he can have some peace in knowing that she did it. Why do you think Frances was not looked at more closely during the initial investigations? Saget County is located in the northwestern part of the state of Washington, USA. It is known for its picturesque landscapes, shaped by the Saget River and the Cascade Mountains. The county is home to several charming towns and communities, such as Mount Vernon, Anacortes, and Cedro Woodley. Lush with forest and waterways, Saget County offers many outdoor recreational activities, including hiking, fishing, boating, and birdwatching. No one would ever guess that a place this beautiful has been holding the dark secrets of a mysterious crime for over 30 years. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was born on March 7, 1969 in Victoria, British Columbia. She grew up in a loving household with her parents, Willem and Jean Van Cuylenborg, and she shared an idyllic childhood full of laughter with her older brother, John. Tanya's family had a love for adventure and often enjoyed long boating trips across the beautiful Salish Sea, creating cherished memories together. Two of Tanya's favorite pastimes were sailing and strumming melodies on her guitar. She also found joy in playing tennis on their spacious one-acre property. She was a determined student who advocated for a girls' basketball team at her high school, showing her passion for equality and sports.
She did play tennis and basketball, but socializing with her friends was a big part of her life. And
Tanya had a soft spot for animals and longed for a furry companion. Finally, in 1982, her mother gave in, and a golden retriever named Tessa joined the family.
Caring for our family golden retriever and other pets was a real passion of hers.
Becoming Tanya's faithful and beloved pet, Tanya dreamed of working with animals, possibly as a veterinarian. J. Rowland Cook was born in December 16, 1966, in Saanich, British Columbia. He grew up in a warm, close-knit family with two loving sisters, Laura Lee and Kelly, and their parents Gordon and Leona Cook. Standing at an impressive height of 6'4", Jay possessed a lanky frame at 20 and had yet to fully develop into his adult physique. Jay was not just an ordinary young man from Vancouver Island. He had a passion for music and had mastered playing the bass guitar, rocking out with his friends.
Jay was the type who was quiet, but someone who you wanted in your circle, someone that you wanted to be friends with, because he'd take the shirt off his back and give it to you if you needed it. He's the type that avoided a fight. He wasn't the type that would go out and initiate any sort of physical violence with anybody.
He was working at a pizza parlor and was known for his dedication. Once, he biked through rain and darkness for 3 long hours while balancing a whole pizza just to surprise his friends staying at a cabin. However, Jay had a peculiar quirk of misplacing his clothes and often returned home without his jacket, feeling puzzled about its whereabouts. He possessed a heart of gold and frequently treated his younger sister to special outings like dinners and high tea, using the hard-earned money he made at the pizza parlor. He aspired to become a marine biologist. Jay and Tanya's paths crossed in the halls of Oak Bay High School, igniting a connection that would shape their lives. Despite being 2 years older than her, Jay was captivated by Tanya's charm. By May 1987, with Tanya on the brink of graduation, their friendship blossomed into a romance.
They met through some mutual friends. They'd both gone to the same high school in Victoria, and they'd been dating about 5 or 6 months at the time.
Although their future plans were not set in stone, their dreams held the promise of a meaningful and exciting future. Through it all, the young couple radiated happiness, earning the admiration of their family, who saw the love they shared Their relationship had spanned only 6 beautiful months when tragedy befell and snatched away the young couple's promising future together. On the chilly morning of November 18, 1987, Jay woke up excited about picking up his girlfriend Tanya and embarking on a road trip from British Columbia to Seattle in his father's shiny copper brown 1977 Ford Club van. Jay's father, Gordon, who ran his own business, required furnace parts worth $750 from Genesco Heating in Seattle.
His father owned a heating business, and they had a job that they were working on where they needed some furnace parts in Seattle.
He asked Jay to collect the parcel from Seattle, as he was already going there with Tanya. The couple got ready for their cross-border road trip, excited about the long hours they would spend in each other's company. Tanya also packed her camera, a Minolta X700 with a 35mm lens, hoping to capture some memorable photos of their time together. After a smooth ferry ride on the MV Coho from Victoria to Port Angeles on the Washington coast, Jay and Tanya continued their journey along Route 101 toward Bremerton. However, they accidentally missed the exit of the Hood Canal floating bridge and found themselves in the charming town of Hoodsport by 8 p.m. Seeking guidance, they entered Hoodsport Grocery, where they encountered a friendly store clerk named Judith Stone, who helped them with directions. As the evening unfolded, Jay and Tanya continued their journey and arrived at the peaceful town of Alan. They stopped at Ben's Deli Mart for some food at 9:29 p.m. The friendly clerk at the deli noted that the couple appeared calm and relaxed, traveling without any companions. It was late in the evening, well past 10 p.m., when Jay and Tanya finally reached Bremerton and purchased a ferry ticket to Seattle for the next day. Their plan was to find a suitable spot to park their van and spend the night before continuing their journey the next morning to collect the parcel. The next day, November 19, 1987, they boarded the ferry from Bremerton to Seattle, ready to continue their adventure. However, destiny had something unexpected in store for them, as this was the last time they were seen. They never reached Genesco Heating to pick up the parcel. They were scheduled to return home that same evening, but to the dismay of their families, they never arrived. Tanya's older brother, John Van Cuylenborg, was away at college when he received an alarming phone call from their concerned father, Willem. Tanya and Jay had not returned home and had not called to inform of any change in plans.
My dad called and asked whether I'd heard anything from Tanya and Jay, and I think they were hoping that maybe by chance they decided to come home a different route.
This unusual silence worried both families, who knew Tanya and Jay were responsible young people and would always call if they were going to be late.
When they didn't return home, my parents were quite certain that there was something wrong. It was very out of character for Tanya to not be in communication. I mean, this was pre-cell phones at this point in time, but still the family expectation that we had at that time was if your plan was going to change like that, you had to at least phone in, tell the parents what was going on.
Despite their growing concern, their parents clung to the hope that maybe the van had broken down and left the couple stranded without access to a phone. As the morning of November 20th arrived, without any word from Tanya and Jay, a wave of panic washed over their families. The unsettling silence drove them to report their beloved children as missing.
Initially on that Thursday, my dad started to approach the local police saying they were missing and started the process, so to speak.
This sparked a massive search operation as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police contacted the Seattle Police Department about the missing couple. Determined to find their children, the families went to great lengths and even hired a plane to soar above the area where Tanya and Jay had last been seen, hoping for a glimpse of their van amid the vast expanse.
You know, it takes them a while to be convinced, I think, that there's something amiss because there was really no evidence of anything being wrong yet. You had a couple of quite young kids, a few hours overdue. I think it was a bit of an uphill battle that my dad had, convincing the police of that. Someone he knew had a small aircraft who did some search by aircraft over the Olympic Peninsula and across over Seattle through the Olympic Mountains. From that distance or range, they were looking for the van.
For the investigators, the search for Jay and Tanya was like unraveling a complex puzzle. With no trace of the couple and no clues to guide them, the police faced a challenging task. Step by step, they retraced the path Jay and Tanya had taken, reconstructing their trip to try and unlock the secrets behind their sudden disappearance.
They boarded a ferry that runs regularly between Victoria and Port Angeles on the Olympic Peninsula, which is part of Washington State. So they took the ferry across to Port Angeles, cleared customs, then started driving down the peninsula.
There were 2 witnesses that had seen them at sort of mom and pop grocery stores on the peninsula. So that told us that they traveled through Hoodsport, through Allen. And then of course we knew that they had at least purchased a ferry ticket to cross from Bremerton to Seattle.
After nearly a week of uncertainty, fate dealt a devastating blow. On November 24, 1987, a passerby gathering cans in Skagit County stumbled upon a heart-wrenching scene. Beside a weathered culvert along Parson Creek Road, some 80 miles north of Seattle, lay the lifeless body of Tanya Van Cuylenborg. She was found unclothed from the waist down. The shocking cause of death was soon uncovered. A single gunshot to the back of her head, inflicted with a .38 caliber bullet. That evening, with a heavy heart, John took the somber responsibility of identifying his sister's lifeless form.
My mom earlier that afternoon had received a call from the Skagit County Sheriff's Department saying that they'd recovered a body that they thought might be Tanya, but there was no identification with the body, and so they were wanting a family member to come identify the body. It was a very quiet, somber drive. You know, very difficult time. You're hoping that it's not Tanya, but after not having any other answers, there's a bit of a sinking feeling that this may well be the answer. But very quiet. There wasn't a lot to be said between the 4 of us, and unfortunately, after we got to Cedar Woolley, and my dad and I together identified Tanya's body. She wasn't battered or beaten in that sense, but unfortunately was lifeless. It was very hard for me to see how devastated my parents were from this, but there's nothing I could do to fix it, so other than spend time with them.
As Chief Deputy Ron Panzero of the Skagit County Sheriff's Office described, Tanya's body was found with the distressing signs of a violent attack. A trace of another person's DNA was recovered from inside her body. During the investigation, a dedicated volunteer named Jennifer Sheehan Lee discovered a shell casing from a .38 caliber bullet not far from Prairie Road.
The area for about 25 feet around the body to see if anything obvious or unusual was there. I found what appeared to be brain tissue, like something had leaked out of the gunshot wound, and that was collected.
Along the road, the officers found plastic ties, commonly used for bundling wires, which they believed were used to restrain Tanya in the van.
At the top, just looking, found a pair of zip ties that were discarded, fairly close to the road actually.
As the investigation deepened, the detectives couldn't ignore the puzzling absence of Jay in the van. Their suspicion immediately turned toward Jay as a potential suspect in Tanya's tragic murder. However, both families vehemently disagreed with this notion, as they knew Tanya and Jay were intensely devoted to each other and deeply in love. Their relationship had been filled with joy and had never exhibited any signs of trouble or violence. On November 25, 1987, a day after Tanya's body was found, a perplexing discovery shed new light on the case. The authorities located Jay's van in a bustling parking lot in downtown Bellingham in Whatcom County, 90 miles north from Seattle. The detectives scoured the surrounding area and stumbled upon a treasure trove of evidence just 2 blocks away from the van. Tanya's wallet, ID card, driving license, the van's keys, and most importantly, A box of bullets that seemed to be of .38 caliber had been discarded near the Greyhound station in Bellingham, approximately 16 miles from where Tanya's body had been found.
A woman who worked at Essie's Tavern in the city of Bellingham was out on the back porch, and she and another employee found several items, namely a purse that had Tanya's identification in it. And in further searching, keys to the van were found under the porch, along with surgical gloves, a partial box of ammunition, zip ties, and a lens cap for a Minolta camera.
Curiously, these items were found hidden beneath the porch of a local tavern named Essie's, adjacent to the busy Greyhound bus station. Inside the van, they made a series of unsettling discoveries. They found zip ties in Tanya's black pants, which raised their suspicions. The money order for Janesco was still inside, unused. A stained comforter and a used tampon were evidence of a distressing struggle.
And we examined anything we could find inside the van.
There was some blood on the middle seat, or what appeared to be a blood stain. In the back of the van, they found a pair of black pants, which appeared to be a pair of female pants. And they found a used tampon sort of back in the rear compartment near the spare tire.
The presence of orange Camel cigarette butts in an ashtray hinted at a connection to a third person and possible killer in the van, since Tanya and Jay never smoked. Authorities also found a pair of surgical gloves that they believed the killer had donned to avoid leaving behind any telltale fingerprints. Also in the van were various receipts, including the ferry ticket from Bremerton to Seattle, confirming that Jay and Tanya had indeed taken the second ferry as a part of their journey. There was a fuel receipt indicating that the couple had stopped to purchase fuel along the road between Port Angeles and Bremerton. These findings provided valuable clues and helped the investigators piece together the timeline of their travels. However, one significant item was missing: the Minolta X700 35mm camera that Tanya had brought along their journey. Tragically, on November 26, 1987, a group of pheasant hunters made a grim discovery: the lifeless body of Jay Cook, concealed under the majestic high bridge overlooking the Snoqualmie River in Snohomish County. His head and torso were carefully covered with a blue blanket, and investigators who gently unveiled the blanket were met by a horrifying sight.
His upper body was covered in a blue fleece blanket, so you couldn't see a lot at first, other than his legs sticking out from the blanket. They start to remove the blanket, and they quickly realize that there's a lot of blood. He has numerous wounds on his head, on his ear. It appears there's a ligature.
Jay had suffered severe head injuries from a beating, and his life had been cruelly cut short by strangulation with twine tied to two vivid red dog collars. On top of that, a pack of Camel lights and some tissues had been forcefully pushed down his throat.
They tied twine and a dog collar around his neck and strangled him, and they'd also beat him in the head with rocks. It was a very violent murder.
They could see in his mouth at the time was what appeared to be a pack of cigarettes. There was a tissue that was stuffed down Jay's throat.
Sergeant Robert Bart from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office noted that Jay's hands had been bound with plastic ties, similar to the ones found near Tanya's body, which is often a sign of an individual with a criminal past. What added to the intrigue was the location where Jay's body had been found, in Monroe Honor Farm, just a few miles away from Monroe Correctional Prison. Detective Jim Scharf of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office had a sinking feeling that the perpetrator could be a seasoned predator, even a serial killer. The search for the double murder posed a daunting challenge to investigators and forensic scientists. The 4 crime scenes were spread across 3 counties: Saget, Snohomish, and Whatcom. A small glimmer of hope emerged when the bullet casing discovered near Tanya's body was found to match the bullets recovered at the tavern in Bellingham. Unfortunately, the murder weapon used to shoot Tanya remained elusive. Among the various leads that were found at the crime scene were blood-stained rocks that investigators had meticulously collected from the surrounding grass where Jay's body had been found. Forensics also discovered a palm print on the back of the van, which they hoped belonged to the killer. In their search for clues, the police focused on the black pants found in the van. They sent the pants to the medical examiner's office for analysis, hoping to uncover a new lead. Upon examination, forensic experts found traces of bodily fluid on the pants. More significantly, the DNA profile obtained from the bodily fluid did not match Jay's, but it did match the unknown DNA recovered from inside Tanya's body. Investigators believe that this mysterious DNA sample was their link to the murderer, referred to as Individual A. The investigation faced a significant challenge as the only evidence leaking all 4 crime scenes were the plastic zip ties discovered near Tanya's and Jay's bodies, as well as under the porch and inside the van. Detective Scharf believed these zip ties were part of the killer's sinister toolkit for committing his heinous acts. Tanya and Jay, described as a mild-mannered and soft-spoken, were not seeking conflict with anyone. The devastating impact of their loss was felt deeply by both families. In a desperate attempt to bring the killer to justice, Tanya's family offered a reward of $50,000 for any valuable information. Although tips poured in from far and wide, none of them yielded the breakthrough they were hoping for. On December 5, 1987, a heartfelt memorial service took place at the University of Victoria's Interfaith Chapel, honoring the memory of Jay and Tanya.
There was a memorial service for her at the University of Victoria at the Interfaith Chapel, and it was a good service. A number of people spoke. There was a lot of people there because of, Tanya, as I say, was quite social, so she had a lot of young people. A lot of her friends were there. I mean, the community was in shock. I mean, for these 2 kids to have gone missing and both found murdered, there was a lot of people there, as happens in these situations. So hard to understand, so hard to fathom how you could, raise kids like that, and then for no apparent reason then, and really as of today, still no apparent reason, have them taken in such a brutal way. So it was just devastated both of them, and it changed their outlook on life, and definitely had a massive impact on them.
Just 4 weeks after the murders, during the Christmas holidays in December 1987, Jay and Tanya's families received the first of a series of chilling greeting cards by an anonymous writer. These cards were filled with disturbing descriptions of the murders and signed by someone claiming to be their killer. Some of these cards were even signed with the names of the victims as Tanya and Jay. Even more unsettling was that the cards were sent from different cities across the United States, including New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle.
Started receiving Christmas cards or holiday cards from someone. Just, happy birthday, Merry Christmas, Happy Halloween, or whatever.
The letters were really unusual because they were coming to the family on holidays and Mother's Day, and they were being mailed from different parts of the United States, like New York, San Diego, and Seattle.
The writer of these cards went to the extent of sending letters to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and a British Columbia newspaper, seemingly finding joy in causing distress and chaos. The already grieving families were further shattered by this terrifying turn of events. Detectives suspected that the author might be a transient traveling along the West Coast, but the grammar and punctuation in the letters hinted at a Canadian education. Phrases like greetings and salutations and Hallelujah, Bloody Jesus caught their attention. As the investigation progressed, authorities worked diligently to collect evidence and conduct DNA tests in the laboratory. They also made a public plea to the letter writer, urging him to provide information about the whereabouts of the lake where he claimed to have left his car during the crimes. While there was a possibility that the letter writer could be the killer, detectives believed it was more likely the work of a misguided individual. This was confirmed when the DNA extracted from one such letter failed to match the Individual A DNA from the crime scene. In 1995, a dedicated cold case team, led by Snohomish County Detective Jim Scharf, was formed with a mission to provide long-awaited justice for grieving families. One of these cases that caught their attention was the double murder of Tanya and Jay. It was then that a new name emerged for a potential suspect, Charles Thurman Sinclair. Charles Sinclair was a notorious figure in western United States, earning the chilling nickname of the coin shop killer. His criminal activities were not typically thefts, but rather the calculated actions of a serial killer who targeted coin dealers and shop owners. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Sinclair terrorized the region, leaving a trail of fear in his wake. The complexity of his crimes initially led investigators to treat them as separate incidents in different states. However, a survivor's description eventually connected the crimes, prompting investigators from multiple states to collaborate and bring the coin shop killer to justice. Sinclair was finally arrested in Alaska in 1990, prompted by a survivor's description, but passed away later that year from a heart attack. Sinclair was suspected of being involved in 11 homicides, but his sudden death meant that the true extent of his crimes could never be revealed. The detectives working on Jay and Tanya's cold case initially believed he might be connected to the double murder, given the circumstances of the killing in 1987. However, unlike other serial killers, Sinclair's motive was primarily financial gain by targeting coin shops and dealers for money. In Tanya and Jay's case, all the money they had been carrying, including Tanya's wallet and the money order in the van, had been left untouched. The detectives then dismissed this theory and began looking elsewhere for clues. For more than 20 years, the murder of the Canadian couple remained a puzzle. In 2003, forensic scientist Lisa Collins from the Washington State Patrol joined the investigation and decided to use modern technology to uncover new leads. She focused on analyzing the DNA profile known as Individual A, which was obtained from bodily fluid found at the crime scene. Collins uploaded this profile to CODIS, the FBI's National Offender Database, hoping to find a match. Despite her thorough analysis and efforts, the database did not provide any matches at that time. Despite the DNA mismatch between Individual A and the letter writer, the police considered the writer as a suspect and wanted him to come forward in case he had some information. A breakthrough occurred when a Canadian resident recognized the handwriting while watching the TV show Washington's Most Wanted and contacted the police anonymously. The tipster provided the suspect's name, which was found in the case files through a database search. Detectives tracked down the transient suspect on October 20th, 2010, who apologized and cited mental illness and years of homelessness as reasons for his erratic behavior. Years passed with no breakthrough in the case, leaving the detectives frustrated. Then in 2018, Detective Jim Scharf learned about snapshot phenotyping, a new tool that used DNA evidence to predict a suspect's physical appearance. Working with Parabon Nanolabs, they analyzed the DNA samples from Individual A and created composite sketches of the suspect at the ages of 25, 45, and 65. Despite releasing the sketches to the public and receiving almost 70 leads, none provided a solid clue or name. But a surprising arrest in California that same year offered a glimmer of hope for law enforcement. A dangerous criminal who went by various names, such as the Visala Ransacker, the Original Night Stalker, and the Diamond Knot Killer, had been causing fear and terror in California for a long time. Spread across 15 different areas, his crimes amounted to more than 50 assaults and 13 murders. He became known as the Golden State Killer and haunted people like an invisible phantom for over 4 decades. The detectives considered the possibility that Tanya and Jay might have been victims of this notorious killer, but the evidence from the crime scene and the killer's methods were different from those linked to the Golden State Killer. In 2018, the Golden State Killer finally ran out of luck in evading capture. Using a genetic database called GED Match, investigators identified Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. as the Golden State Killer, even though he had previously been ruled out as a suspect. This arrest inspired Detective Jim Scharf to consider using the same technology in his investigation. In 2013, Chelsea Rustad, a 31-year-old resident of Tumwater in Washington, began exploring her family history and connected with distant relatives on social media. She identified the Talbot siblings from Snohomish County as her second cousins and got in touch with the two sisters online. But their brother was absent from social media. In 2015, she entered an Ancestry DNA contest by submitting a photo of herself at age 5, dressed as a ballerina on Halloween. That photo must have been a lucky charm, because out of hundreds of entries, Chelsea won a free DNA test kit.
I saw on Ancestry's Facebook page they were running a contest, and 2 winners would receive an Ancestry DNA kit. They contacted me and said, "Chelsea, you're one of the winners." The Ancestry DNA kit arrived. You just kind of spit in a tube and seal it up, and then it was on its way.
And posted her results on GED Match, a DNA database website. Little did she know, a new story was unfolding in the police forensic department as she spent time on the site. In 2018, Parabon Nanolabs uploaded individual A's DNA to GED Match, seeking answers in Jay and Tanya's case. C.C. Moore, a genetic genealogist, took on the challenge. The case held personal significance for her, as she was born the same year as Tanya and felt determined to bring closure to their murder mystery. After a tense night on April 27, 2018, C.C. found 2 individuals in the DNA database who shared enough DNA with individual A to qualify as second cousins. However, they were related to him on different branches of his family tree. C.C. had to trace those branches back to identify the common ancestor and uncover individual A's identity.
I found her birth date, so I put that in here, and then I said she shared 3.35% of her DNA with our unknown suspect. Now I have to identify her parents. Who are her grandparents? Well, I recognized Talbot immediately from the other match's family tree. So right away, I knew, aha, this marriage combines the 2 different families that I'm researching. So then we follow that forward. We say, okay, Patricia Peters married a Talbot and they had 4 kids. And we've got 1 male.
Her determination increasing with every second, C.C. uncovered a web of connections and found a unique name among the cousins. Within 2 hours, she built the family tree and discovered the suspect's name. When the police arrived at the cousin's address, they knew they were in the right place. The door opened to reveal Chelsea Rustad, and the suspect was none other than her mysterious second cousin, William Earl Talbot II, who had no presence on social media. William Earl Talbot II was born in 1969 to William Earl Talbot Sr. and Patricia Peters. William had a regular job as a trucker and enjoyed riding motorcycles and socializing with friends. He lived in a pleasant home near Seattle-Tacoma Airport and had a clean record except for a few minor arrests. From a young age, he displayed anger issues and aggressive behavior. Talbot's younger sister, Melina Grayle, recalled incidents where he had kicked her with boots on and exhibited entitled behavior.
Bill had a lot of anger issues, and he kicked me a few times with boots on, and I ended up calling the police.
She also mentioned an incident from when Talbot was 11 years old and had allegedly pushed their disabled father. Despite counseling, his behavior did not improve. As Talbot grew older, his behavior became increasingly violent. At 16 years old, he expressed his intention to run over his father with a car. He assaulted his sister, Inga, multiple times, once when she was 11, and again when she turned 15, causing serious injuries, including a broken tailbone. Talbot also dropped the family cat into a well, requiring his father to retrieve it and clean the well. Due to his violent actions, Talbot became estranged from his family for nearly 2 decades. Ignoring their attempts to reach out to him, he even neglected important events, such as his mother's funeral, and only sporadically contacted his family on special occasions. Despite his clean record, the police had finally caught up to the killer and all evidence was pointing directly at William Earl Talbot II. For years, he managed to stay unnoticed, living a regular life as a truck driver without any online footprint. But now his true identity was unraveling. Detectives discovered that Talbot had grown up just a few miles away from Jay Cook's body was found, a crucial connection. Detective Scharf faced a critical task. He had to make sure that DNA found at the crime scene belonged to William Talbot. To gather evidence, investigators closely followed Talbot on his trucking routes until an opportunity arose. One fateful day in May 2018, Talbot unknowingly dropped a cup he had been drinking from at a traffic signal and drove away. Racing against time, investigators promptly delivered the cup to the Washington State Patrol Lab. With anticipation building, everyone held their breath, awaiting the results that would either confirm or dispel their suspicions. The state crime lab swiftly tested the cup and confirmed the detective's suspicions. Talbot's DNA matched the evidence from the crime scenes. Detective Scharf was in disbelief upon hearing the news, feeling a rush of emotions.
A really, really powerful moment in my life. My eyes teared up, and I yelled out a scream and said, "We got him."
After nearly 3 decades of anguish and years of relentless work, they had the killer at last. On May 17, 2018, around 6 p.m., William Talbot II was arrested. He was charged for kidnapping, assault, murder, and robbery in Saget County Superior Court for the death of Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Later on June 15, 2018, the charge for Jay Cook's murder was added in Snohomish County Superior Court, as confirmed by Snohomish County Sheriff Ty Trinery. The trial of William Talbot began on June 11, 2019, in Snohomish County Superior Court. He pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of aggravated murder. The prosecution, led by Deputy Prosecutor Matt Baldock, presented DNA evidence, Talbot's proximity to the crime scene, and the presence of zip ties as evidence against him. However, Talbot's defense attorneys, Rachel Ford and John Scott, worked to challenge the DNA evidence and create doubt in the jury's minds. They argued that the DNA evidence was not strong enough to prove Talbot's guilt. During the trial, Dr. Eric Kiesel, a former medical examiner, showed autopsy photos of Jay Cook highlighting his suffering. However, the defense pointed out that Kiesel had previously estimated a longer time of death, raising questions about the timeline. Kiesel clarified that the estimate was not based on solid evidence. Talbot's former roommate, Michael Seat, testified about their friendship and shared memories of snorkeling and doing photography together. As the trial unfolded, another former roommate, Timothy McPherson, came forward and described Talbot as heavy and strong, mentioning that they used to go bowling together. McPherson also stated that he had never seen Talbot with guns, blue blankets, dog collars, or zip ties, and had never seen him smoke. These testimonies conflicted with the prosecution's evidence of Talbot's history of aggressive behavior. The trial grew intense when Talbot's defense team claimed that the detectives had tunnel vision and had overlooked the possibility of another person leaving the DNA evidence at the crime scene. Prosecutor Mark Baldock countered by questioning the plausibility of certain scenarios presented by the defense. Another point of contention was the palm print found on the Ford van's back door, which was initially deemed a mismatch for Talbot, but later identified as a match. The defense questioned the timing of this charge, but did not challenge the final conclusion in court. The defense also suggested the idea of a consensual relationship between Talbot and Tanya as the reason for his DNA at the crime scene, and argued that the unidentified killer had later murdered the couple without leaving any DNA behind. But Talbot denied having any relationship with Tanya, leaving the jurors puzzled about his true intentions and struggling to understand how the evidence fit together. Finally, after just 30 minutes of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous guilty verdict, sealing Talbot's fate.
We, the jury, find the defendant, William Earl Talbot II, guilty of the crime of first-degree murder as charged in Scotland.
Their decision was solely based on the concrete evidence presented by the prosecution in court. Later, during a private meeting with the lawyers, the jury learned that the zip ties found in the victim's van also contained DNA traces that potentially matched Talbot's DNA, providing further proof against him. On July 24, 2019, William Talbot II was sentenced, concluding a groundbreaking trial where a jury found him guilty of homicide. Despite a last-minute attempt by his defense team for a new trial, the judge dismissed their argument, emphasizing the importance of considering evidence in a broader context. Jay Cook's sister also took the stand to highlight Talbot's role in ending the lives of 2 young people. The judge sentenced Talbot to life in prison without parole, despite the defense attorney's statement about his unremarkable life and perceived lack of cruelty. Tanya's close friend expressed satisfaction with the verdict, but acknowledged the lasting sorrow of losing Tanya to such unspeakable violence. In 2020, Talbot filed an appeal, arguing against the use of DNA evidence in his case. He wrote, "Based on Snohomish County's way of thinking, the only possible suspect is the source of that blood, regardless of all other evidence or lack of." He claimed that the DNA alone should not make someone the only possible suspect, disregarding other evidence. On December 6, 2021, concerns were raised about a juror's ability to remain impartial due to emotional influences. Talbot's defense team appealed, claiming bias in an unfair trial. The appeals court agreed, stating that the juror's comments showed actual bias and had not been addressed adequately. The prosecution vehemently opposed the court's decision to overturn Talbot's conviction. As their argument was unsuccessful, the case was taken to the Supreme Court, which upheld the original decision and reinstated Talbot's conviction on December 22, 2022. As a result, Talbot will serve his life sentence without parole at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Chelsea Rustad, Talbot's second cousin, found closure as she connected with the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Attending the sentencing, she offered support to the families and noted the absence of Talbot's relatives. Rustad wrote a book titled Inherited Secrets about the experience of discovering her relation to a cold-blooded killer. Talbot's conviction brought a sense of closure to the families, providing them with peace after decades of pain and uncertainty. Duane Bogle was born on January 18, 1937, in Waco, Texas. His parents, James George Bogle Jr. and Albuquerque Walker, welcomed him with open arms. Duane was a high school graduate from Waco and was adored by his family for his charming personality and great sense of humor. As fate would have it, Duane's journey took him to the U.S. Air Force in 1955. Fresh-faced and full of ambition, it was likely his first assignment after completing basic training and technical school. He was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. For 8 months, he served as an airman second class near the charming town of Great Falls. Little did he know that during his time there, he would meet the love of his life. Patricia Kalitzke was born on August 20, 1939, in the small town of Great Falls. She was a junior at Great Falls High School, and her classmates thought she was funny, caring, and full of energy. She always had a big smile on her face. Patricia seemed to be talented in everything she attempted, including ballet and tap dancing. In December 1955, 16-year-old Patricia crossed paths with 18-year-old Duane. They both shared a passion for dancing and singing, and as fate would have it, Duane fell head over heels for Patricia while stationed at Malmstrom. Their connection was instant, and despite knowing each other for only a few weeks, they couldn't bear to be apart and dreamt of a future together. Patricia's family welcomed Duane with open arms, and during Christmas of 1955, he even stayed at their home, becoming a part of their festivities. On that eventful day, January 2, 1956, Duane and Patricia embarked on a journey to Wadsworth Park, full of joy and anticipation. They said goodbye to their families, brimming with excitement for their very first trip together as a couple. Little did they know that this adventure would soon take an unforeseen turn, altering the course of their lives forever. They had planned to be back home by 9 p.m., but as the hours ticked away, Patricia's parents grew increasingly concerned. Patricia, known for her responsible and punctual nature, had failed to return by her usual 10 p.m. curfew. Frantic with worry, Patricia's parents reached out to her older sister, hoping for any clue of her whereabouts. But Patricia was nowhere to be found. They scoured the familiar places where Patricia liked to spend her time, yet she remained elusive. As their search grew more desperate, a troubling possibility crept into their minds. Could Patricia have followed in her sister's footsteps and eloped with Duane? Having already experienced the pain of betrayal from their elder daughter, as years back she too eloped with her lover, they reluctantly believed the notion that history might be repeating itself. Fearing the worst but burdened by their past heartbreak, they hesitated to involve the police, unsure if Patricia had willingly vanished or if something more sinister had occurred. On a cold January 3, 1956, 3 adventurous boys went for a hike near Wadsworth Park in northwest Great Falls, Montana. As they walked along a dusty path, they came across a strange and unsettling sight. There was a car, parked between 2 trees, still running with the radio playing loudly. Its headlights were still on, and the emergency brake was on. It seemed like the driver had vanished just moments before. Fueled by curiosity, the boys cautiously approached the vehicle. To their shock, they discovered a lifeless man lying face down, partially trapped under the vehicle. They noticed that his hands had been tightly bound behind his back, using what looked like his own belt. The boys immediately alerted the authorities, who wasted no time in rushing to the scene to investigate. They carefully scoured the entire area, being careful not to disturb any potential evidence. During their examination of the body, they found a gunshot wound to the back of the man's head. Surprisingly, there were no other signs of injury on his body. This suggested that the killer's only motive was to end his life swiftly, without prolonging his suffering. As the police searched the car, they stumbled upon a crucial piece of identification, a driver's license belonging to an 8-year-old man named Duane Bogle, which provided a vital lead in the case. The police minds raced with theories, one of which was robbery. The car's engine was still running, indicating a swift getaway by the killer after snatching valuables. But then they had a terrifying suspicion. They believed that something more sinister than just robbery had occurred. At that time, kidnappings were occurring frequently, which raised concerns that Duane might have been deliberately chosen as a target. It appeared that the perpetrator's original plan had gone terribly wrong, resulting in the tragic decision to end Duane's life. The police were determined to find any clue, so they carefully searched every corner of the area. However, the predator had managed to cover his tracks completely, leaving no evidence behind. The police then contacted Duane's family and shared the devastating news of his murder. When Duane's parents received the shocking information, they were overwhelmed with disbelief and sorrow. They couldn't comprehend how someone could harm their beloved son, who was always full of joy and loved by everyone. It was an incredibly heart-wrenching moment for them. Upon hearing the news, Patricia's worried parents stepped forward and shared crucial information with the police. They revealed that Patricia was also with Duane and hadn't returned home either. Concerned for her safety, they expressed their fear that if Duane had been killed, then where was Patricia? The police were puzzled because during their initial investigation at the crime scene, there were no signs of Patricia nearby. Determined to find her, they returned to the scene and intensified their search. It was on the following day, January 4th, 1956, that Patricia's lifeless body was discovered by a road worker along Vineyard Road, 5 miles outside of Great Falls. The grim location was nearly 8 miles away from where Duane's body had been found. It was evident that Patricia had likely been kidnapped. Tragically, a trail of blood leading down the rocky ravine indicated that her body had rolled to the spot from the gravel road above. Like Duane, she had also suffered a gunshot wound to the back of her head. Little did the authorities know, this was just the beginning of a twisted and chilling mystery. The police decided to investigate the sequence of events and gather information about Patricia and Duane's last known movements. They discovered that the couple had been seen together at Pete's Drive-In restaurant, enjoying a drink on the evening of January 2nd, 1956. According to the restaurant staff, they arrived at 8:30 p.m. and left shortly after 9. They were alone in the car during their visit. The location where Duane and his car were found was known as a popular spot for couples, leading the police to believe that Patricia and Duane had driven there willingly. It seemed that their killer had come across them at that spot and forced them out of the vehicle. Authorities firmly believed that Duane and Patricia had fallen victim to the same perpetrator, given the striking similarities in their deaths. The unsettling circumstances pointed to a chilling execution-style killing, where both victims were forced to kneel before being fatally shot in the back of the head. As the investigation progressed, a chilling detail emerged. Patricia's body, discovered at the bottom of a rocky ravine, was fully clothed, except for a single missing shoe that was never found, which had slipped off as she rolled down the embankment. The initial examination of her body also provided no conclusive evidence of assault. However, as the investigation deepened, a surprising twist emerged. The results of further testing and examination painted a completely different picture. The revelation came when injuries consistent with assault were discovered on Patricia's body, contradicting the initial assessment. They were also able to take a swab from her that they hoped would help identify the killer. Unfortunately, the technological limitations of the time prevented any conclusive findings. However, all the testing reports and evidence were carefully preserved for future breakthroughs that could unravel the mystery. The coroner's assessment added another layer of intrigue. It was believed that Duane had actually clung to life for several hours after being shot. The shooting itself was estimated to have taken place sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, and Duane's tragic demise occurred between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Authorities were dedicated to identifying the killer, and they launched a massive investigation. Sheriff DJ Leeper from the Great Falls Sheriff's Office went the extra mile by using his own money to buy a polygraph machine that could potentially unlock vital clues. They called in an expert from Seattle to ensure its proper use. A team of 10 officers devoted themselves to the case, working day and night. The search began for anyone with the potential motive to harm either Duane or Patricia, as the net of suspicion widened. Patricia's mother, Catherine, shared a concerning conversation she had with Duane the day before his lifeless body was found on January 2, 1956. Duane seemed troubled, and Catherine, being a caring mother, asked him what was bothering him. Duane revealed that he had been upset about a recent argument he had with a friend from Texas. This piece of information piqued the authorities' interest, as they wondered if this friend could be connected to Patricia and Duane's murder. Somehow they tracked down the friend and questioned him for 4 hours. Eventually, the police had to release him when they couldn't find any evidence linking him to the murders. Moreover, he was proven to be in his Texas home at the time of the murder. Frustratingly, the police couldn't find a clear personal motive behind the murders of Duane and Patricia. This roadblock narrowed their investigation options, so they shifted their focus to the people who had been out drinking on the night of the murders, and also tried to identify the individuals who kept guns with them. Just when things seemed bleak, 2 witnesses emerged with a surprising piece of information. On January 10, 1956, they informed the police about a man who not only possessed a gun, but was also seen returning to his house around midnight, clutching the weapon in his hand. This information sparked a glimmer of hope that they might have finally caught a break in the case, but their hope quickly faded. When they confronted the person and spoke with him, he vehemently denied leaving his house that night and claimed to not even own a gun. The police's suspicions were nearly enough to arrest him based on the testimony of the 2 men. However, in a shocking turn of events, the witnesses eventually confessed after hours of intense questioning. It turned out that they had been lying all along. Driven by their deep hatred for the man, they saw this ongoing investigation as an opportunity to fulfill their desire for revenge. This revelation left the police stunned and frustrated, realizing that they were back to square one in their search for the true culprit. After 2 months in March 1956, Sheriff Leeper had to end the full-time inquiry into the case without identifying the killer. The lack of progress was disheartening for the sheriff, who expressed his frustration and regret for not catching the person responsible for the deaths of Patricia and Duane. The investigation continued, but after a year, on the 1-year anniversary of the murders in January 1957, the sheriff spoke to the Great Falls Tribune. He shared his determination to keep going, saying, "I guess it's just one of those things, but we're not giving up. Maybe this year we'll catch him. He must have made a mistake. They all do. Someday we'll find out what it was, and then we'll have him." The deaths of Duane and Patricia had a deep impact on their families and the communities they belonged to. Patricia's father, Henry, became emotionally numb and found it incredibly difficult to acknowledge Patricia's death. Patricia's sister, Darlene, shared in an interview with the television show Hard Copy that their father, Henry, couldn't bring himself to talk about Patricia or cope with the loss. In order to find solace, Darlene chose to cherish the happy memories she had with her sister. Despite the pain, both families knew that nothing could bring Patricia and Duane back. The loss was so difficult to comprehend, and finding closure seemed like a distant possibility. Patricia's mother, Catherine, shared that she and Duane's mother exchanged letters for years after the murder. Their correspondence served as a way for the two families to connect, united by the tragedy and grief they experienced. All the while, the case had been cold. In 2001, Detective Phil Madison joined the investigation into Duane and Patricia's murder with a fresh approach. He discovered a swab taken from Patricia's autopsy that had been stored as evidence for over 45 years. With advancements in DNA technology, the swab was sent to the Montana State Police Crime Lab for analysis. Shockingly, the lab found a cell in the swab that did not belong to Duane, confirming that Patricia had been assaulted. Authorities spent the next few years comparing the DNA from the cell to more than 35 suspects previously identified. However, none of the suspects' DNA matched the one found on the swab. The investigators also checked the DNA found on the swab against national criminal databases, but no match was found. They looked into suspects such as James Whitey Bulger, a notorious mobster from Boston, who had lived in the Great Falls area during the time of the murders. Bulger had a previous arrest for assaulting a 15-year-old girl in 1951. Another potential suspect was Edward Wayne, a convicted serial killer who had murdered 2 couples years after Duane and Patricia's death. The police thought he might have been in the Great Falls area during that time, but he denied any involvement. Both Bulger and Wayne were ruled out as suspects when their DNA did not match the DNA found on the swab. The investigation went on for another 18 years until a breakthrough emerged, inspired by the technique used in solving the Golden State Killer case in 2018. Detective Sergeant John Cadneron, who was assigned to the case of Patricia and Duane's murder, had a strong determination to take the investigation forward. He teamed up with forensic scientists to gather more DNA evidence from the swab taken during Patricia's autopsy. In 2019, they adopted a cutting-edge method called genetic genealogy using Bogle technology. This innovative technique allowed forensic genealogists to compare the DNA profile found at the crime scene with profiles in public genealogical databases. By analyzing the shared DNA, they were able to uncover distant relatives and construct a family tree. It was like solving a puzzle, connecting the dots between different individuals and their genetic ties. With the meticulous construction of the family tree, the investigators were on the verge of unmasking the suspect. However, there was a chilling twist in the story. The prime suspect had already passed away, and his remains had been cremated, making it impossible to obtain a direct DNA sample from him. Undeterred, they turned their attention to the suspect's children, who resided near Great Falls, and requested their DNA for comparison. To their surprise, the DNA from the children confirmed that their father was the source of the cell found during Patricia's autopsy. It was a devastating realization for the children to discover that their beloved father was responsible for the death of 2 people. On June 8, 2021, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office officially announced the identity of the perpetrator in Patricia and Duane's murder as Kenneth Gould, who also lived in Great Falls. After thorough investigation and confirmation through DNA analysis, the authorities strongly believed that Kenneth Gould was the one responsible for the murders of Patricia and Duane. However, since Gould had already passed away, he cannot face a trial or be officially named as the killer. Instead, they can only label him as the most likely suspect in the case. This groundbreaking announcement came more than 65 years after Patricia and Duane's tragic deaths, marking it as the oldest case in the world ever solved using the innovative technique of genetic genealogy. Kenneth Gould, a local horse trainer, had spent his early years in Great Falls, Montana. He got married in 1952 when he was 24 years old to 16-year-old Lulabelle Brown and started a family raising 5 children. Surprisingly, he lived just a short distance from Patricia's house and was frequently seen riding horses in the area at the time of the murder. Despite his proximity to the crime scene, Gould's name never appeared in the police files, and there was no apparent connection between him and Duane or Patricia. Curiously, a month after the murders in February 1956, Gould sold his family property and embarked on a series of moves across Montana, eventually settling in Missouri in 1967. From that point on, he never returned to Montana. Gould's journey came to an end in 2001 when he passed away in Oregon County, Missouri, at the age of 79. His life remained intertwined with the mystery of Patricia and Duane's murders, leaving unanswered questions about his possible involvement and the reason behind the murders. Speaking about the case, Detective Sergeant John Cadner from the Cascade County Sheriff's Office mentioned that people can have secrets they never tell anyone. Because a lot of time had passed between the murders and Gould being identified, many of Patricia and Duane's loved ones had already passed away and couldn't hear the news. Patricia's only surviving sister, Darlene, had advanced dementia when Gould was finally identified. The resolution of the case evoked various emotions within Duane and Patricia's family. Although they were relieved to finally have answers, Gould's identification brought back memories and reopened old emotional wounds among the relatives. Duane's niece, Karen Bogle McCarthy, expressed her thoughts to the New York Times, saying that the use of modern technology in solving the case was beneficial for her generation. Karen was the daughter of Duane's younger brother, James Jim Bogle, who had always looked up to Duane while growing up. Unfortunately, Jim didn't live long enough to witness the identification of his beloved brother's killer, as he passed away in November 2013 due to a neurodegenerative disease. Patricia and Duane's surviving family felt a great sense of relief as they no longer had to deal with the wild speculations and strange theories surrounding the case. One theory that deeply upset Duane's family was the belief that he had become involved with the mob in Great Falls, leading to their tragic deaths. There were also rumors suggesting Duane's involvement with drug dealers in Texas. However, Gould's identification not only revealed the truth about who took Duane away from his family, but it also put an end to decades of speculation and rumors. While closure has been found, the emotional wounds remain for the families affected by this tragedy. What are your thoughts on this case? What do you think could be the possible motive for Duane and Patricia's murder?
County 911.
Help me! Help me!
Ma'am, where are you?
Please help me!
Ma'am, what's going on? Ma'am.
My husband's hurt himself. Hurry!
Okay, where is your husband? Where's your...
He's in the bed. Please hurry!
Okay, ma'am.
On March 13, 2003, Raynella Leath walked into her bedroom to a sight that would change her entire life. One question plagued them. Why had Dave taken his own life so abruptly? Was this something that happened in the spur of the moment, or had it been planned beforehand? Knoxville is the county seat of Knox County, Tennessee, also known as Marble City. With a population of just under 200,000, Knoxville has an easy southern suburban atmosphere with tight-knit communities. But despite its small-town vibe, Knoxville has a higher crime rate than most American cities of the same size. For every 100,000 citizens, the crime rate is 379.6. And yet Knoxville is a charming place to live with its museums and parks. Being a university town gives it this perfect blend of age and youth, old and new, vibrant and rustic. And this is where our story takes us. Raynella Bernadine Large, later known as Raynella Leath, was born on October 25, 1948, in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Raynella was born in the mountains of Tennessee and at a very young age moved to Oak Ridge, which was one time a secret government facility.
Her father, Dewey Ernest Large, was a nuclear scientist, and her mother was Annie Large, a school teacher. Raynella was raised in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where she attended Oak Ridge High School and graduated in 1966. Raynella grew up in a safe and isolated community designed to accommodate workers at the nuclear power station where her father worked. Like every tight-knit community, the residents of Oak Ridge knew one another well and didn't deal with many outsiders. Crime was minimal, and children could play outside without adult supervision or fear. The community was also very conservative and dominantly white. Although prohibition, a set of laws that criminalized the production and consumption of alcohol in the U.S., ended in 1933, alcohol consumption was strictly forbidden in the county where Raynella grew up. As a young girl, Raynella was very bright. She excelled academically, always at the top of her class and even taking extra classes when possible. Her safe and solid upbringing made her confident in her abilities and helped her excel in school. After high school, Raynella attended East Tennessee State University, Knoxville, where she trained to become a nurse. While in college, she met an ambitious and intelligent business student who wanted to attend law school after college and become a lawyer. Edward Dossett, also known as Ed by his friends and family, was a soft-spoken man with a friendly but handsome face.
She and Ed had met at East Tennessee State College. They were in undergraduate school together there.
When he met the beautiful, dark-haired Raynella, it was love at first sight. Before long, he had asked for Raynella's hand in marriage, and she said yes.
Ed Dossett was a good old Tennessee boy, raised out in a rural area.
In 1970, Raynella and Ed got married and moved to Knoxville, just outside Raynella's hometown. Ed's family had a dilapidated but large farm in Knoxville. With the help of an architect, Ed rebuilt the farm so he and Raynella could settle down and start their own family. After Raynella graduated from college, she started working as a nurse in a hospital in Knoxville.
Raynella was working at the hospital as a charge nurse. She was a very respected professional in the field.
By 1972, Ed had completed law school and began a career as a proud country lawyer. In 1982, the Attorney General for Knox County retired, and Ed decided to run for the office. Ed brought his usual determination and enthusiasm into the campaign, and his efforts were rewarded when he got elected into the Attorney General's office.
Raynella was an important and visible part of his campaign. She spoke up for her husband and was very strong and assertive in her defense of his abilities. And people listened to Raynella. She was one of those people that just had a presence when she walked into a room. You couldn't ignore her.
By 1978, Raynella gave birth to their first child, Maggie Dossett. And on July 18, 1983, their second child was born, a boy named Eddie. In 1985, Raynella gave birth to the couple's third child, a beautiful baby girl named Kate. When Ed served as the Attorney General, he had a secretary named Kay. Kay and her husband Steve were good friends of the Dossetts, and both couples often hung out together. But with the arrival of their child, increased pressure from Ed's job and Kay's first pregnancy, which made her resign from her secretary job, the four of them began to spend less time with each other, or at least two of them did. The other two, Ed and his former secretary Kay, continued seeing each other because they were having a secret affair. As an elected public servant in a conservative county, having an affair was perhaps one of the worst things Ed could do to ruin his career. But Kay, unhappy in her marriage with Steve, was in love with Ed. And as for Ed, one of the few things keeping him married to his wife was that leaving her would hurt his political ambitions. He was not exactly experiencing marital bliss. Almost everyone who knew Raynella and Ed knew that Raynella was not the easiest person to be with. She was bossy and controlling with a mean attitude that made everyone around her keep a distance from her. They knew not to mess with her. Raynella and Ed, who were once so in love with each other, started to have marital problems because of Raynella's controlling attitude. To make matters worse, Ed soon began to suffer from chronic stomach pain. Once, at a local authority meeting, someone noticed Ed grimacing in pain and asked him if he was okay. Ed's reply was strange. He said that he had the meanest wife in the world, who was trying to kill him. By October 1991, Ed's stomach pain had gotten so bad that he was admitted to the hospital. Shockingly, after a series of tests, the doctors informed him that there was a cancerous tumor in his small intestine and liver, which had spread to other organs in his abdomen as well. Raynella took this news in stride, but for some reason she felt the need to hide Ed's illness from the rest of the world. Ed's diagnosis meant that he was dying already, and if word got out, he would have to resign from his job, losing his income. Perhaps Raynella felt that by hiding the illness, Ed could continue working and beat the cancer somehow. But Ed only got worse. In March 1992, Ed's cousin Elizabeth traveled 500 miles from Illinois to come and see him. Ed, desperate to have his family around him, had written to her. When Elizabeth arrived at the Dossett home, she was shocked at the welcome, or lack of it, that she got from Raynella. Raynella bluntly refused to let her see Ed, and didn't even allow her to enter the house. Upset, Elizabeth realized that there was nothing she could do, so she went back home. Later, she would receive a letter from Raynella, telling her that Ed was in such bad shape that he could not receive visitors. Gradually, Ed gained some energy that allowed him to return to work. Although in constant pain, he approached his illness with his usual determination. But despite his best efforts, Ed's condition worsened, and he had to leave work again, this time for good. For the rest of his life, Ed remained bedridden, constantly pumped full of morphine to ease his suffering. On July 9, 1992, police raced to the Dossett residence after receiving a chilling call from a local market director. According to the director, Raynella Leath was claiming to have found her husband, Ed, lying on the floor outside, unconscious. When they arrived at the scene, they met a hysteric Raynella hovering around Ed, who was unconscious. She claimed she had found him there after he insisted on going down to see the cattle. She did not mention his terminal sickness. Rather, she told the operator she believed their cattle had trampled on him. From all indications, the only thing investigators could make of the scene was that it appeared to be an accident. But when police interviewed Raynella later, her story wasn't quite straight. According to her, Ed had suddenly insisted he go down to see the cattle. When he did not return inside on time, she went back to check on him and found him lying on the ground. She believed something must have set the cattle off because they were scrambling out of their pen. Even though she did not find a pulse when she checked for one, she immediately began CPR on him. Raynella then claimed that she tried to call 911 on her cell phone, but didn't get any response. So she ran back into the house to call the local hospital, but realized she couldn't remember the number. Police found this strange because Raynella had worked at the same hospital for years as the director of nursing. But since she had not been working for quite some time, they believed it might be possible that she had forgotten the number. She then called the director of a local market and asked him to call an ambulance. An ambulance did arrive soon after, so Raynella's story seemed accurate. When the ambulance reached the hospital, 44-year-old Ed Dossett was pronounced dead on arrival. The police launched an investigation into his death because they suspected foul play, but they ultimately agreed with Raynella's story and ruled the cause of his death as an agricultural accident. Although police had closed the case, not everyone was convinced that Raynella was telling the truth. People who had seen Ed in the weeks leading up to his death claimed that he was acting very strangely and could barely stay conscious for more than a few minutes at a time. He also found it difficult to walk straight, as if he was constantly intoxicated. It also seemed implausible that Ed's cattle would stampede him without any reason. Then again, autopsy reports showed that Ed had bruises, internal injuries, and hoof prints on his body, suggesting cattle had indeed trampled him. There was also the fact that Ed's life insurance policy had a double indemnity clause, so if he died by accident, his beneficiaries would receive twice the amount than any other cause of death. Since his death was ruled an agricultural accident, Raynella would receive that double amount.
Ed's life insurance policy had a double indemnity clause. That meant if Ed died because of an accident, there would be a double payout.
On top of all this, Raynella's reputation as a no-nonsense, bossy woman made people suspicious of her. She had told police that when she discovered her husband was dead, she was so enraged with the cattle that she grabbed a gun and shot one of them. But when law enforcement examined the cattle, they found none with bullet wounds. And interestingly, they also did not take note of the morphine in Ed's bloodstream, which would have been quite substantial since he was taking heavy doses of it to help with the pain. Despite these inconsistencies in Raynella's story, local law enforcement did not pursue the issue any further. They also considered the possibility that he might have orchestrated the entire thing, just so his wife and kids could have more money when he died, since he knew he didn't have much time left anyway. Ed's funeral was another strike against Raynella, as she decided to bury him on the farm, rather than where his family said Ed had wanted to be buried. During the funeral, Raynella appeared too serene for someone who had just lost her husband and the father of her children. Some even said she was cheerful, moving from guest to guest as though it were a regular party and not a funeral. After Ed's demise, Raynella decided to become a full-time homemaker to spend more time with her kids. But she began to get bored or restless, so she began spending time with her children at a nearby pool owned by a man named Dave Leath. Dave was also Ed's friend and was generally well-liked in the community. He was married and had a daughter, Cindy, whom he absolutely adored. Apart from being married to people they didn't like and having children, Raynella and Dave had very little in common. While Raynella had a solid upbringing and was well-educated, Dave was a high school dropout with no other qualifications. After dropping out of school at 19, Dave found a job as a barber and eventually opened his own barbershop. He was fond of cars and always spent his free time tinkering with one or watching stock car races. But despite what some might have called his shortcomings, Dave was always certain of one thing: he was very handsome. Dave was not ashamed to spend extra money in effort to look good. He had undergone several plastic surgeries, including a facelift and a tummy tuck. And to an extent his efforts did pay off, because he was considered an attractive man by many. Unfortunately, Dave had an accident that subtracted from his beauty, at least by his standards. One day while chopping wood, he got a splinter in his left eye. To mask this defect, he took to wearing sunglasses to cover his eyes and never looking directly at people when he wasn't wearing the shades. The more time Raynella spent at Dave's swimming pool, the closer they got. Before long, they had begun having an affair. When Dave's wife found out, she immediately filed for divorce. But Dave didn't care. He was head over heels in love with Raynella. Little did he know that his love affair would be the biggest mistake he would ever make. In January 1993, 6 months after Ed died, Raynella married her boyfriend Dave.
Like 6 months after he died, that Dave and Raynella got married.
In a tight-knit community like Knoxville, marrying your husband's friend so soon after his death was scandalous.
A lot of people may look at that and say, wow, 6 months, that's a short amount of time.
But the gossip soon died down, as Dave and Raynella often walked around town, hand in hand, laughing and beaming at each other. They appeared to be genuinely in love with each other, and they were for a while. But just like her previous marriage, Raynella soon began to express her bossy nature with Dave, and this affected Dave quite negatively. For example, Cindy, Dave's only child, once found Dave sitting in his pickup truck, sobbing. When she asked him what the matter was, he said he and Raynella had a fight, but it was nothing to worry about. In 1994, Ed and Raynella's last child, Eddie, died tragically in an accident. 11-year-old Eddie and his sister, 15-year-old Maggie, were driving around in their mother's car. Maggie had a provisional license, which meant that she could only drive when someone else with a proper license was in the car with her. On that fateful day, Maggie was driving unsupervised with Eddie in the passenger seat, when Maggie lost control of the car and hit an oncoming vehicle. Eddie wasn't wearing a seatbelt then, and on impact, he was ejected out through the passenger side and died.
Little Eddie and Ed are both buried on the Dossett family farm, side by side, I believe. It's a very sad story. Raynella is a woman who has had a lot of misfortune happen in her life.
When police questioned Raynella, she claimed that she had been in the vehicle, although several witnesses asserted she wasn't. But the police took her word for it and did not press charges against her. Maybe if the police had done their jobs, some of the tragedies that occurred in the lives of everyone around Raynella would not have happened, because Raynella was not new to violence. Shortly after Raynella's son, Eddie, died, Kay, Eddie's former secretary, sought a divorce from her husband, Steve. During the divorce proceedings, Steve discovered that his second child with Kay was not his child. It was Ed Dossett's child. When Raynella got wind of this, she invited Steve to her house to talk about their partners and the whole situation. During their conversation, Raynella confessed that she knew about the affair, but had decided not to say anything about it. After their little chat, Steve went back home. The following day, Raynella invited Steve over again, claiming she had found papers that proved both of Kay's children belonged to Ed, not Steve.
She said, I found some stuff today that will be interesting to your divorce. And so she said, I'm going to take you to the farm.
What did you think she had found?
Well, she told me she found papers.
Naturally, Steve was curious. So when Raynella asked him to come over to see the documents, he did not hesitate. Upon getting to the Dossett farm, Raynella led Steve to a barn where she claimed she had found the documents. When they entered the barn, she pointed him to a bucket sitting in the corner.
You go over to the paint can.
There's no papers. I turn around, and here she comes around the car, and she's got this towel and a gun.
Raynella began firing at him with a revolver she was now holding, but she missed the first few shots.
You're laughing now, but you weren't laughing then.
I wasn't laughing then. And so anyway, that's when she brought it up and started shooting. Well, I run out the other end of the barn.
When you were running, what was going through your mind?
You're absolutely running for your life. There's no doubt in my mind. If she hadn't run out of bullets, I'd be dead.
Steve managed to escape the farm and immediately reported to the police. But Raynella, anticipating this, had called the police first. In a panicked voice, she narrated how Steve had come to her house with a gun, threatening to kill her. She knew this would make the police restrict Steve from seeing his children, which had been her plan all along. She wanted to take custody of the boy that Kate and Ed had together, but her story did not make sense, so she was charged with attempted murder and granted bail for $10,000. Her attorney tried unsuccessfully to get the charges dropped, but in January 1996, a grand jury indicted her. 2 weeks before she was set to face trial for attempted murder, Raynella went for a plea bargain. Pleading guilty to assault, in exchange, the attempted murder charge was dropped and wiped from her record, and she got 6 years of probation and 100 days of community service. Meanwhile, Raynella continued to exercise more and more control over Dave. Dave changed his will and made Raynella the sole beneficiary of his estate after his death. Not even his beloved daughter Cindy or her son Dave's grandson would get a dime after he had passed away. He also ensured his mother's home would pass to Raynella after she died. In January of 2000, Dave began to suffer from some medical conditions, including hallucinations, high cholesterol, and even had a stroke once. Raynella immediately took charge of everything, forbidding everyone from seeing Dave. Not even his daughter Cindy was allowed to see him. However, Dave recovered from his illness and was discharged from the hospital, but he was forced to retire from his barbershop, as he could not leave home for long periods. Alongside his many illnesses, Dave began to suffer from short-term memory loss and early-onset dementia. During one of his visits to a neurologist, he mentioned that he felt his wife was trying to kill him. He could faintly remember her pressing a pillow to his face. It sounded eerily similar to what Ed had said about his wife just a few months before he passed away, but his neurologist brushed it aside as one of his hallucinations. Meanwhile, Dave's mother was also diagnosed with ovarian cancer and had to be admitted to the hospital. On March 13, 2003, Raynella visited Dave's mother in the hospital. While there, she suddenly called Cindy, asking if she had seen Dave. Raynella said she had left Dave's food on a bedside table, and she was worried he might have gone out without eating. Up until this point, Raynella had forbidden Cindy from seeing Dave, so the call seemed strange. But Cindy said she had not seen him. Raynella rushed home, worried that something might have happened to Dave. When she opened the bedroom door, she found Dave lying in bed, his food untouched. He had a bullet wound on the left side of his head, and there was no pulse. He was dead.
County 911.
Help me! Help me!
Ma'am, where are you?
Please help me!
Ma'am, what's going on? Ma'am.
My husband's hurt himself. Hurry!
Okay, where is your husband?
Hurry! He's in the bed. Please hurry!
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, I need you to calm down so I can get some help to you, okay? Ma'am.
When police arrived at the house, they immediately suspected foul play. Raynella had informed them that Dave tragically took his own life, but given his deep affection for his daughter and grandchild, he simply did not fit the profile for someone who would end their life so abruptly. Just a day before his body was discovered, Dave had offered to help a friend with some repairs. He seemed in good spirits, even though he was in pain from his illness. As investigators interviewed Dave's family members, they found another reason to doubt Raynella's suicide story. Dave was afraid of guns. Even as a child, when his father took him hunting, he would refuse to use the gun to shoot any animal. He had never owned a gun as an adult.
According to Raynella, when she left the house, she left breakfast by the bed for Dave.
Also, crime scene investigators discovered that 3 shots had been fired from the gun. The first one missed, the second one was the fatal shot, and the third also missed.
Not unheard of. Sometimes in a suicide case, you'll have a hesitation shot where someone is shaking and it misses.
The shots had been fired from Dave's left side, meaning he would have used his left hand. But not only was Dave right-handed, he was also completely blind in his left eye due to the splinter incident. So logically, he would not have used his left hand. Based on all this, the police determined that Dave did not take his own life. But if he was murdered, who did it? Without any further evidence, the case went cold. Much to Dave's family's displeasure, Raynella had Dave's body cremated. Cindy was devastated about her father's death. When she was invited to his will reading and she found out that he had not left anything to her and her son, she became livid. She accused the police of mishandling the case and pressed them to look deeper into it. She wrote to the DA's office severally, asking them to take another look at the case. The case went unsolved for almost 3 years, and she only grew more desperate to see justice served. By 2006, when it seemed like she would not get what she wanted, she hired private investigators and filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Raynella. Cindy wasn't asking for money. She only wanted Raynella to forfeit all the inheritance she got from Dave if Cindy won the case. The lawsuit made law enforcement look closer at not just Dave's death, but also Ed's. Upon further investigation, they discovered that the autopsy conducted on Ed Dossett's body was at the best not credible. Randall Bedigo, the medical examiner who had carried out the autopsy, had a long history of substance abuse. which meant that he was likely under the influence when he conducted Ed's autopsy. Otherwise, he might have noticed and mentioned that the morphine in his system, which according to the new medical report, was so extraordinarily high, it's unlikely that any human could function in an ambulatory manner or continue to live. In 2006, Raynella was charged with administering an overdose of morphine. It turned out that Ed had died from a morphine overdose, not being trampled by cattle. Investigators also discovered that before Dave's death, she had secretly gone to a funeral home to make an upfront payment for Dave's cremation. With this new information, the police were ready to make their next move. In November 2008, Raynella was charged with the first-degree murder of Dave Leath. Although she was arrested, police placed her bond at a ridiculously low $5,000. Yet there was no court date for her trial. In September 2007, Raynella entered a not guilty plea to the charge of Dave's murder, but she would not go on trial until March 2009. But the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a mistrial. It did not matter that of the 12 jurors, only one voted for not guilty, while the others believed she was guilty. She would go on trial again in 2010. This time, ballistic experts testified that the bullet that had killed Dave was fired from 12 to 14 inches away, which was too wide a distance for someone who allegedly committed suicide.
If I were to lie in bed and I were to aim at my head and pull the trigger and miss high and create this.
Yes.
And then if I fell and my hand squeezed again, it would be consistent with this direction.
Not just with the direction, but also with the distance.
Also, no fingerprints were found on the gun, suggesting that whoever fired the gun had the opportunity to wipe it. At the time of his death, Dave had up to 4 different medications in his system that would have made it impossible for him to sit up on his own, let alone hold a gun and fire it. The prosecution maintained that Raynella had killed Dave. She set it up to look like a suicide, then went to the hospital to visit his mother, where she was sure CCTV would provide her with a solid alibi. On January 25, 2010, the jury returned with a verdict after deliberating for 2 days. They found Raynella Leath guilty of first-degree murder of Dave Leath, and she was given a life sentence. The prosecution dropped all charges related to Ed's case afterward. In early 2011, a court ruled that Dave's last will was invalid because his illness implied that he was not of sound body and mind. Raynella had to give up half of everything she had inherited under the will. Raynella's lawyers tried to appeal the case, but they were unsuccessful. They tried again in 2013, but it was denied. By 2015, Raynella's new defense team argued that Dave's illnesses made him susceptible to depression and mood swings, which could have made him so depressed that he would take his own life. Also, they argued that the judge in the previous trial had been under the influence of drugs because of his addiction to narcotics. In January 2017, Raynella went on trial for the 3rd time. This time, the defense established the prosecution's case was circumstantial at best, and that there was every likelihood that Dave had taken his own life. Raynella was acquitted.
In short, the state has failed to meet their burden. The defendant's motion for judgment of acquittal is granted. The defendant, Raynella Leath, is not guilty. The case against Raynella Leath is dismissed.
We may never know why, but although Raynella Leath was dragged to the judicial system several times, she always came out on top, unscathed, and her victims were left to nurse their wounds privately. As long as she has lived in the quiet little community in Knoxville, nobody dares to question her or cross paths with her. Now, once again, Raynella Leath is free to resume her normal life as a mistress of a prosperous farm. Ed's family members will never know the true cause of his death. Cindy Leath may never get the justice she desperately needs for her father. As for the questions, we might never get answers. Do you think Raynella killed Ed Dossett and Dave Leath. Do you think the justice system failed in its duties in this case? Share your thoughts in the comments section. If there is a case you'd like us to cover, don't hesitate to share your suggestion. For more captivating true crime stories, like, share, and subscribe to our channel.